Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we are going to be reading some true paranormal horror stories. I hope you enjoy them. But before we get into the stories, I would like to thank and introduce the person who is reading the very first story in this video. Many of you will already know her. Her name is the one and only Raven Reads. I am so stoked to have this collaboration. It's one that I have dreamed of ever since I started this channel, and I cannot thank you enough, Raven, for joining me on this video. Thank you so much. If you haven't checked out her channel in the past, for whatever reason, make sure that you go into the description down below and click on the link to her channel and go subscribe to her channel. She does excellent work. She's an excellent narrator, and she definitely deserves your view. Also, I am going to be on one of her upcoming videos as well. Depending on when this is posted, it'll probably either be the next week or the week after that I will be on one of her videos as well, so make sure that you keep an eye out for that on her channel. But anyways, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true scary stories.
Some childhood memories were so scary to me that I will never forget them, like this one memory that I'm about to share with you. When I was like 5 or 6, I strongly believed that I was met with a ghost in my own house. One night, when I was watching TV in my living room on the couch, I got distracted by a rocking chair moving back and forth. That was odd. The windows were open, but there was no wind blowing. This was in the fall season, so we didn't need to put on the AC. It was a little off, but I figured that it rocked back and forth because it was just a really old rocking chair. It stopped rocking a minute later and didn't move again. The next night, when I was watching TV again, I heard a cup fall to the ground from the shelf. Something wasn't right now. Why would it just fall like that? I thought it was probably just a draft, so I walked over to the kitchen area, which was right next to the living room, and I picked the cup off the floor and placed it back where it was. Nothing happened again that night or the next night. The night after, I was watching TV yet again, and out of the blue, a radio set, which was on a desk right next to the TV, turned on. This was not a draft. A radio set can't just turn on by itself. It would only turn on if someone turns it on manually. At this time, I started crying, and I ran to my parents' room while I heard the radio still playing. I barged right in to see my mom on the phone with someone. I heard her say to whoever she was on the phone with, "Hold on 1 second." She asked me what was the matter. I exclaimed that the radio just turned on out of nowhere and that I think a ghost did it. She rolled her eyes and sighed and said, "Come walk with me." So we went together to the living room. When I got back to the living room, the radio was now turned off. My mom then told me, "See, there's no such thing as ghosts." I told her I was being for real, but she didn't buy it. She walked back to her room and continued her conversation where she'd left off with whoever she was on the phone with. No sudden movements ever happened again. I was so scared to go into that living room for a while. I eventually faced my fears later on, but it will always stick with me, forever. I know most people don't believe in the paranormal, but I firmly believe that a ghost was in my house, way back when I was just a child.
In 2014, I was staying in a women's shelter with my child, my mom, and my brother. About a week after we got there, we were talking with the other women, about 6 of them, and one of them says, "Have you met him yet?" We asked who, and she proceeded to tell us about a little boy who haunts the shelter, and the other women said that they've all seen him as well. They said he's harmless but creepy. We were, of course, like whatever, not real, but still felt creeped out. My family shared the same room, and the other was on the second floor with no balcony or anything. One morning I woke up, and my brother told me that he saw the boy last night. He said he woke up in the middle of the night, and the little boy was standing at the edge of the bed looking at him. Then, when my brother tried to talk to him, he ran out of the wall/window. I was thoroughly creeped out. A few days later, my child woke me up in the middle of the night around 2 to 4 a.m., so I went to go make him a bottle. We were the last room at the end of the hall, so out of habit, I would always look at the window at the end of the hall when I leave my room. When I walked out, I shut the door and made sure it locked. Then when I turned, I looked into the window and I see a boy in red overalls with a yellow shirt and no hair reaching for me. I ran so fast down the hall and down the stairs. When I got down the stairs, it was pitch black, and the worker was cleaning with no lights on. The next day, I asked my brother what the little boy was wearing, and he described it exactly, right to the bald head. I was so freaked out. I asked the women, and they described the outfit as well. The worker was off for a couple of days, so I had to wait to talk to her. But when she came back, I asked the worker why she was cleaning in the dark, and she told me it was because he wouldn't bug them when the lights were out. I have a few more stories as well. Let me know if y'all want them. I've never really been a big believer in religion or the paranormal, but I feel like what I've been experiencing for the past 5 going on 6 months is starting to change my perspective on the topics. So starting in May was my first ever encounter with something that you could say. I'm a night owl, so I stay up fairly late. This night it was around 4 to 5 a.m. and I'm laying down in my bed on my phone watching TikTok. The way my bed is set up in the corner of my room, horizontally towards the door. So when I lay on my side, I'm either facing the wall or the door. In this instance, I was facing the wall, wide awake, when I heard something walking towards my bed. I have carpet, so I'm not sure if anyone else knows what I'm talking about. But you can hear when someone is walking on it. The noise it makes when the weight of someone's foot is being put down. It's almost like a scrunching sound. I turned around to see if maybe my mom was walking into my room for whatever reason, but there was no one there. It freaked me out, to hear but not see anything. Eventually, I just put it off and fell asleep. Told my mom in the morning, but you know how people are when it comes to stuff like this. They tend to have every possible explanation in the world to falsify things. Fast forward about a month later. Once again, I'm in bed, up late at night on my phone, but this time facing my door. The light from the phone in my eyes, so the surrounding area sort of blurs out, and I'm wide awake as well. When again, I hear something coming towards me. But this time, it wasn't regular walking. It was more like a quick shuffle towards my bedside. And these past 2 instances have been clear as day to hear, so I know that I wasn't tripping. Wanted to put out there that the month of July prior to this past one, my grandma passed away peacefully in her home. I was there by her side through the whole thing. It's just me and my mom that live in the house, and I told her again. She told me that other family members have been visited by grandma in their dreams prior. I also have seen her in my dreams as well, way before any of this. My mom was really down about it, because she says that her mom hasn't come to see her in her dreams yet. But fast forward to about 2 months ago. I was up around 2:30 a.m. just finishing out the shower when I walked out of the bathroom. My mom was asleep and I was walking to the laundry room when I heard something downstairs, like metal clanking on the floor. Not dropping, but being tapped like someone was holding it and tapping it. I froze and tried to focus my hearing, but when I did, it stopped. Then I continued to walk. Then it picked up again, and when I stopped, it stopped. I tried to silence my steps to see if it would start again, and it did, I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and did a full sweep of the downstairs and didn't find anything. Absolutely nothing that would be the source of this sound. I told my mom again, and she said it was probably my grandma. She's said this for every time that I've told her about something I've experienced. At this point, I started to get angry because I felt like I was being toyed with and my grandma wasn't that type of person. I was drawn between believing my mom and going off of what I literally experienced myself. And this is where it gets funny. And I mean like funny in an I'm so angry this is laughing type of way. I was again in bed about 2 weeks ago on the phone, and my ceiling light turned on. It was 4 in the morning, and it just turns on, and I just lay there staring at it. I literally took a picture and sent it to my brother. I could feel the annoyance building up in me at this point, and I was tired of it. And for a little background on my ceiling light / fan situation, the way mine works is that it has a pulley that you can pull on the ceiling fan itself to turn the light on and fan on. Short pulley for the fan and long pulley for the light. Then you have the light switch on the wall, which allows you to control only the light. But in order for the light to be turned on from the wall, you have to turn the light off from the pulley on the fan. I had my light on before, but turned it off from the fan, meaning only it could be turned on from the switch on the wall, which is across the room. And whatever it was did that. I got up looking, and my switch was flipped, meaning it forcibly had to be clicked. Literally, my body froze, and I ended up sleeping with all the lights on. I told my mom in the morning because I stayed up all the way till she left for work since I was terrified, and she just said it was my grandma once again. Now fast forward to today. Earlier this morning, I was up, went to walk downstairs, and I kid you not, it looked like a dark shadow cloud was hugging the side of the wall on the steps. I felt my heart pick up, but I tried to ignore it and continue down the stairs like I didn't see anything. I went to get a water bottle for my hamster, came back up to give my hamster some water. Then, as I was walking to my shelf to set the water down, I looked down the hall and I thought I saw the same shadow cloud go into my mom's room. My mom's room is directly down the hall. I turned on my flashlight, and as you can guess, nothing was there. I told my mom once again, and she just said it was my grandma. For extra info, my house was built in 2009, and I've been living here since. I'm a 19-year-old male and just wanting to know if there's an actual explanation for this. Or am I really experiencing the paranormal? I figured I'd take it to the experts. You guys. Thank you for any help, and I appreciate any responses that you can give me. I woke up somewhere between 3 to 3:15 a.m. because I was so hot and thirsty, and I noticed the hall light, it phases through all the collars, was red, which isn't unusual, but I noticed it just because of the time. I drank some water and laid back down and just felt odd. I always do in the dark. But I wake up for work at 5 and wanted to get some rest. But no matter what position I was in, I couldn't go back to sleep. At around 3:33, my fiancé started making this horrible groaning/growling noise I have never heard him make. The closest I can describe is the Annalise Michael audio tape of Cain. I shook him a few times and called his name, but it took so much more effort than it usually does, as he's a very light sleeper. Throughout all of this, the hallway light remained red. When he woke up, he held me, and after some explanation of what happened, he turned on the regular hall light for me to try and get some sleep. I'm not sure what happened, but a little after 4, I was finally able to sleep. For additional information, we moved to a new apartment at the beginning of September, but haven't had anything like this occur since being here. My fiancé does on occasion snore, but this is a sound I have never heard before. We've lived together for a little over a year, but have known each other for 7 to 8 years. Sorry for the formatting, I don't post often. But if anyone has any idea what to do, I'm open to anything. I regularly sage my house and add Palo Santo, whenever I feel it's needed. There's salt at my front porch door, but if I need to change anything, I will. I went out for a drink with a friend of mine yesterday. Before I get to the paranormal part, I have to provide some context. We were at a Mexican restaurant, and she was asking me if I was one of those people that couldn't stand cilantro. But she got the herb mixed up and asked about oregano, so we ended up joking around about oregano for a bit. Later on in the conversation, we start talking about weird things that we may not know about each other. So I told her about the time that I saw an extraterrestrial in my bedroom. She's not the type of person who believes in these things, but she was very respectful and asked questions about it. She asked me later to send her a drawing of what I saw. So this morning I texted her a quick sketch. Maybe 30 minutes later I went into the kitchen to get a drink and saw an oregano container out on the counter. It was open on its side on top of an oven mitt. I use oregano maybe a couple of times a year, and I live by myself. I keep it in a cabinet towards the back, so it's not possible that it could have somehow fallen out, opened, and ended up on the glove like that. I immediately got the expression that something was letting me know that they were listening to me at the restaurant. I really don't know how else to explain it. Has anyone else experienced this? My wife yelled at me from our kitchen, and I went in and asked her what's the matter. She told me that she saw a flash of light similar to a flashbulb from a camera going off. I thought she was seeing things, and a couple hours later she said that it happened again. I still didn't give it too much thought. I was standing in front of the stove later in the evening, and what do you know? The walls I was facing both lit up momentarily, exactly like a camera flashbulb going off. I've checked every light, anything I thought may be the culprit. Has anybody else ever had this happen to them? And if you know, then what is going on? I was wondering if anyone had a scientific explanation for this phenomenon. My mom was telling me that her bedside lamp, which according to her has been unplugged for months, has been turning on randomly. She tells me that she witnessed the light come on twice, albeit dimly for a couple of seconds each time. This was over a week ago, and I don't think it's happened since. I'm 26, and my mom has had that lamp for most of my life. But as far as I know, it doesn't have any interesting history behind it. I'm pretty sure that it was store-bought when she got it. This is 3 stories in one, because they all happen in the same house or town. In 2007, I was about 11, and my mom moved us to a small town near our family's res. Where we lived, that part of town was built on old indigenous burial grounds. It was me, my mom, my 2 younger siblings, and a cousin a couple years older than me. We always heard things, people saying our names, things being moved, things out of the corner of our eye, etc. But being so young, it slipped our minds easily. What didn't slip our minds was the uneasiness we felt. All of us felt watched constantly. We were never alone in the house. If we had to be, we would hang out outside instead of staying inside alone. One day, we were messing around with my mom, and she was chasing us around the house. So we ran upstairs into a bedroom and locked the door. Mom banged on the door saying, "Open it, I'm gonna get you," etc. Then all of a sudden, she started banging. "Let me in. Open right now. Oh my God, open now." So we did, and she ran in and locked the door. My mom was so pale and looked like crap. After calming down, she told us that after banging, she turned to go downstairs, and when she looked down, there was a man with long black hair and a top hat peeking his head around the corner at the bottom of the stairs. This man proceeded to step out in all black and looked as if he was going to come up, which is when she started banging and yelling at us to open up. Another time in this same house, my cousin was napping, so I crawled in with her and Big Spoon, and there was a small TV facing her bed. I was dozing off, and I felt something hit me, and when I looked, there was a fist-sized indent on the bed/blanket. In the summer of 2007, a woman was brutally killed, and my grandma was friends with the cops, so she told my mom, right in front of us kids, all the horrible details. We lived about 3 to 4 houses down from the woman, and we all hung out with her the night it happened. For days, we would walk by and see blood all over the window. A couple weeks later, we were walking by again, and we saw that poor woman in her window. My cousin and I started running because we knew what she looked like, and we knew what happened, so we got super scared, obviously. Thankfully, we moved that summer. Hello, I'm new here, and I have this story that I've been needing to get off my chest. So ever since I moved into this house in 2018, everywhere I go, even at high school, I hear what has got to be a spirit following me, and it mimics people I know, and usually it's someone I know that is alive. Sometimes even my parents' dogs. I'm not a dog person, and I think the spirit knows that. But the mimicking of dogs started to happen when I had to move out of my house in 2021. And ever since, the spirit never leaves me alone. Coincidentally, this only started occurring after my grandfather passed from cancer in 2020. Now in my new house, that spirit keeps mimicking my dad's dog and barks loudly once, and sometimes scaring the heck out of me. It literally just happened right before I made this post. But I have managed to learn this about the dog bark. It's only one very loud bark and then it stops. When my dogs normally bark, it's usually quieter, but more than once. I'm always inside when they are outside. One weird thing, the spirit has never mimicked my cat. No joke. I have a theory that could explain this. And no, it's not because it's a black cat. That's not how this works. Or does it? Because I don't know. I think cats have some kind of meaning towards spirits. Or at least this particular spirit. The internet calls these kinds of spirits mimics. Anyway, maybe the mimic might not mimic my cat because 1, the cat is nearby constantly, therefore being no reason to mimic the cat. And 2, I love the cat so much, maybe making the spirit not want to mimic the cat that I love. The spirit hasn't mimicked my parents for 1.5 months, and I love them too. Anyway, that's all I got for this story. Tell me what you think, if you want. So to start, I want to say although I've had a lot of paranormal activity in my life, I'm very logical when it comes to experiences. I would say 99 times out of 100, there is a reasonable explanation for the weird things that happen, but lately it's just been strange. Some backstory to start, my husband has had tinnitus for years now. Some days good, but mostly bad. One day he said he felt like he was going schizo, and I chalked it up to him going crazy with the ringing in his ears, and that reality was getting harder for him to deal with. I comforted him, but didn't ask too many questions. Sometimes he just wants to vent and not answer 100 questions. So fast forward to me sitting in bed a couple weeks ago, and in the doorway I see what looks like part of a head poke around the corner, peering into the room, then quickly jerk back into the hall. I knew no one was upstairs, but I got up, saw my husband downstairs on the couch and asked if he was just upstairs. He replied no, and I said, well, I saw what looked like someone peering into the room at the corner of my eye. I joked about shadow people, because at this point with living in our house, it's kind of been an on and off occurrence. I'm honestly not even fazed, more fascinated. He said, you know, it's weird because I've felt like I've been going literally crazy. I've been seeing stuff like that a lot recently. We both were a little weirded out, but oh well, at this point. Then a week ago he was in bed and he saw something move at the corner of our bed, then suddenly disappear. Another weird occurrence I experienced was right before I saw the head in my doorway. I had a strange sleep paralysis. I was laying in bed vibing with this odd, energetic flow, not realizing I was asleep, while my husband was laying to the left of me. All of a sudden, a hand slid onto my stomach from the right side. I freaked out, screaming in my dream for help, and finally woke up. My husband was asleep, and the weight of the sleep paralysis lifted. But sometimes when I wake from that state, my brain feels full. Like it's still working out the sleep chemicals, and I haven't regained full alertness. It's very odd. But during this state, I can see things move that aren't there. So I look and there's a shadowy figure on top of him. I thought it was him moving his legs in the dark, but then I realized it wasn't. As soon as I realized it wasn't, I noticed this thing was holding something that looked like a phone screen. It was just a rectangle of white light. I told myself that I must still be in a dreamlike state because of the way my head felt. I put the covers over me and tried to relax until I was more awake and with it. Then I looked at my husband's side of the bed where his legs were, and whatever it was vanished. I told myself it must have been the moonlight, even though my curtains were fully closed. Again, I'm so used to weird stuff that I'm not afraid of it anymore. Just really interested in what is going on, whether it is some scientific phenomenon or something actually paranormal. Then today, I got weirded out by something out of the blue. I was working the lunchroom at my kid's school, and at the table where my kid sat last week, in the exact same spot, there was a small Tupperware container missing a lid. Last week she lost this piece and only had the lid. I noticed the missing Tupperware right away because OCD, and I couldn't find it anywhere. Here it was today, right where she sat. Now today, that side of the table was empty, with other kids sitting on the opposite end. I was like, oh, someone probably picked it up and just put it here, but it was weird that it was exactly where she sat. Then a little while later, one of the kids sitting at the other end of this table was very distraught. She had one strawberry left in her lunch. She got up, came back, and it was gone. I said, well, maybe you ate it and forgot or it fell. She swore up and down that she had one left and someone must have taken it. I was like, well, we are going to have to let it go, because if no one comes forward, we can't accuse people of taking it. I know this is very off topic from shadow people, but I definitely had some intrusive thoughts of maybe things are disappearing to another time. Is this table some weird time-jumping portal, victimizing Tupperware and strawberries? I know that can't be right, and it's just a case of kids being kids and misplacing taking stuff. But with all the incredibly weird stuff happening lately, I can't help that my brain is going to crazy places of thought. But if a lone strawberry magically reappears in that spot next week, it will be the end of my sanity for sure. I was also wondering if anyone else has been experiencing occurrences that seem strange and out of the ordinary. I swear, I really am logical and don't like giving too much weight to paranormal things, especially when there's most likely a logical explanation, but the air feels different, and I love hearing about unexplainable things. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. I want to mention before we get into this video that this video is a compilation video of many different paranormal stories that I have read before on this channel. You can kind of think of it as a best of paranormal video, where I went back to my old paranormal videos and took some of my favorite stories that I have narrated and put them into this one compilation for you all to enjoy. So, I hope you enjoy the stories, and I hope you have an excellent night's sleep. And without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. This event happened some time ago in the early 2000s. It's not made up. I really experienced these events, even if they sound crazy. My parents were in a rough patch, and my dad had moved out of the house. I was in high school at the time. It started out one night my mom and I were watching TV. It sounded like scratching noises and heavy dragging noises in the attic, and we immediately assumed raccoons. I don't remember the timeline exactly, but we kept hearing this noise, and each time, the noise slowly crossed from one end of the attic all the way to the other end of the house. My mom did have a company come check for animals, but they didn't find any. Then the real scary stuff started happening. I was asleep one night and woke up to a figure next to my bed. The best description is a shadow person. I slowly grabbed my blanket and covered myself up with just a peephole to watch it. It was entirely black, even darker than the dark room around it, and it looked like the darkness was slowly streaming off of it. I was both amazed and terrified. I watched it for what felt like hours until it slowly backed out of my room. I was afraid to leave my bed, and eventually I fell asleep. The next morning at breakfast, my mom said that she saw someone standing at the foot of her bed, and then I told her what I had seen. There was a heaviness in the house after that. Other times I remember waking up at night and hearing voices and whispering. Sometimes I could hear music playing like it was an old theater or something. When I peeked outside my room, the noises would cease. One night, the dresser drawing at the foot of my bed slammed open and shut. Another night, Mom started screaming in the middle of the night, and I grabbed my baseball bat and ran into her room. Just outside of her bedroom door was a chair, and I swear that I saw this shadow figure sitting in it as I ran into her room. She told me something had laid down on her bed next to her. As the events/encounters progressively got more frightening, we were afraid to stay in that house at night. I would sleep with all the lights on, if I could sleep at all. We started spending nights in a hotel. Even in the daytime, you would hear things like someone calling your name. I can't remember how long the haunting lasted. I'm guessing at least 3 to 4 months had passed, and my mother was tired of being afraid in her own house, so she had the house blessed. Sometime in the next few days, my mom was heating up a cup of water for tea in the microwave, and it exploded in the microwave. I asked her how long she had put it in the microwave. Then boom, these loud scratching sounds ran down the walls around us. A dark mist filled the house, the voices and whispers all around us. My mother and I grabbed each other's arms in horror. All of these sounds were happening simultaneously. And then this very deep, unnatural voice began talking over all the other noise. It was deep and unnatural, and if it was some sort of language that I've never heard or something like that, not even to this day. As my mother and I stood there, we looked down the hall towards the voice. Something was there. It was like a freaking horror movie. It was quadrupedal, made of the darkness, like drawing with a Sharpie in the air. It had what looked like several rows of spines down its back. And then my mother started to pray, and so did I. The creature slowly backed down the hall and into a bedroom, and slowly, all of the noises and voices faded away. The mist and haze seemed to follow it down the hallway, until everything returned to normal. I never saw or experienced anything again in that house. If anyone was curious, yes, when friends came over, they would have experiences as well. I've had other experiences since then, but nothing like back then. Sorry for the length. I'm sure I've left out some bits, but thanks for reading. Okay, something weird happened last night. I had a deep conversation with my mom, which was basically her lecturing me for 30 minutes. I was having a silent meltdown while we were talking, and I had the urge to say what I wanted to say to defend myself, but I couldn't because I believed I'd cry. Then, 3 to 8 minutes later, after she went out of my room, I heard dogs outside barking, and I just laid there, hopeless, and I questioned my existence. Like, literally, I did. I heard my family outside and my mom was like, "What's that smell?" I overheard her saying she smelt flowers and that the living room door opened itself. Really, I couldn't care less, because I also smelled something like that 2 years ago. Anyway, I was in my room wanting to cry while listening to their murmurs from our living room. They were like, Mom said, "You there?" My second cousin said, "He's not here, Aunt. He's grounded." Mom, what? No one opened the door? Cousin, I never heard anyone, so probably not. Mom, but the door literally opened itself. Grandma, it must have been the wind, honey. Mom, no, it looked like someone seriously pushed the door open. Cousin, I was busy with the phone so I couldn't see it, but there's no wind, Grandma. Mom, and that smell. Smells like flowers. Do you smell it? Cousin, nope. Grandma, I don't smell anything. And I was like, oh please, a spirit is obviously here. Grandma, who was it? Mom, after I scolded my name, this happens. Grandma, do you think it's a ghost? Mom, I don't know, but if it is, it's probably here because I scolded her. Then my mom came rushing in my room. I didn't say anything, just hopelessly facing my back against the door while laying down. She approached me and asked, "Hey honey, are you okay?" I still feel terrible because of the conversation, so I didn't say anything. But she keeps on asking, "Are you okay?" What do you guys think? Was this a spirit? When I was a kid, I lived in a haunted house. I'll preface this by saying I'm generally a very rational person and I'm a very skeptic person by nature. I didn't grow up in a family that was religious or into the supernatural. And if I hadn't experienced these things myself, there's no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't believe in it today. Our house was built in 1912. On the outside, it seemed like a totally normal house. The moment I stepped inside that house, I felt uneasy and I couldn't explain why. My sister and I shared a room upstairs. I was sitting on my bed in my room one day, facing the doorway. It was one of those accordion doors that would click closed, and there was a space of about 2 feet at the bottom where it didn't reach the floor. It was only my mom and I home at the time, and she was downstairs. I heard the floor creak outside my door in the hallway, as though someone was walking into my room. Then I saw a white mist-type figure pass by my door. At first, I thought it was my mom bringing laundry upstairs, and I waited for her feet to appear under the door, but they didn't. I went and peeked under my door to see who was in the hallway, and there was nobody there. There was no wind, and no way it could have been a curtain blowing. I definitely saw something pass by my door. Another day, I was in my room alone again. My family was downstairs in the kitchen at the time. There was a wardrobe by the door that had a lamp on top of it. I was just sitting on my bed again, and all of a sudden, the lamp started to violently rock back and forth. It scared the crap out of me, so I immediately ran downstairs, and my family could see that I was scared and asked me what was wrong. I told them what happened, and they all looked at each other. I discovered later they tried to protect me from knowing any of the paranormal experiences that happened there. Another day, my sister and I were in the living room. It was summer, and we had one of those window air conditioners in the kitchen window. My dad was just finishing building a detached garage outside and had turned the breaker off so that he could finish wiring the electrical to the garage. There was no electricity at all in the house. We were just sitting there, and all of a sudden we hear the air conditioner turn on. My sister and I looked at each other and ran outside. My parents asked us what was wrong, and we told them how the air conditioner turned on by itself. My dad said that's impossible. There's no electricity going to the house. We had no explanation for how it turned on. Another day I was in my room, and we had one of those big fans that sat on the floor. My sister would always yell at me for leaving it on when I wasn't in the room. On this day it was really hot, so I purposefully left the fan on. I went downstairs to have a shower. Only my mom and sister were home at the time. I came back up to my room and the fan was switched off. I immediately felt uneasy because I knew I had left it on. I asked my mom and sister if they had gone upstairs while I was in the shower, but they hadn't. No explanation for how it turned off. This was back in the days where we would record songs off of the radio on cassette tapes. One day I guess I forgot to press stop while recording and had left the room. When I listened back, it sounded like a man and woman arguing on the tape, but couldn't quite make out what they were saying. There was no one in the room at the time. When I would go to sleep at night and the lights were out, I would see what I now know were probably orbs, but at the time I had no idea what they were. It was like static electricity in the air. I don't know how to explain it. The closest thing I've ever seen to it are sparklers. It used to scare the crap out of me, and I would run to my mom's room to tell her, and she would say, "Oh, it's just your eyes playing tricks on you. Don't pay attention to it." I would go back to bed and hide my head under the covers. There was a spirit that would stand in the corner of my room and watch us constantly. After we moved out, I told my mom one day that our new house felt so much happier than our old one. She asked me what I meant. I told her how our old house had such a heavy atmosphere and felt totally different, and I always felt like I was being watched. I asked her if it was haunted. She finally admitted to me that it had been, and they had tried to protect me from it because I was the youngest. I described two of the ghosts to her, the female that was always in the corner of my room and the male spirit that stayed in my brother's room. I described the time period they were from and how they were dressed. That the woman was in a long dark dress and that the man sat on the floor in my brother's room and looked out the window. No idea how I knew these things, and turned out I was pretty close. Except for the woman wore a black veil that hid her face, and the man actually had no legs, which was why I thought that he was sitting all the time. While we lived there, I had a recurring dream where I saw a little girl in a white nightgown cowering in the hallway outside my bedroom and crying because the house was on fire. I was constantly paranoid about fires while living in that house, and would constantly check the electrical outlets throughout the house to make sure that everything was okay. After we moved, I worked at our local library, and there were tons of resources about the history of the town. Turns out, before our house was built at that location, there was a hotel that used to stand there in the late 1800s that had burned to the ground, killing several people. My dad was the only one who didn't have experiences while we lived there. My mom had the most experiences, and I think at first he started to think that she was losing her mind. It wasn't until my siblings and I started to tell him about our experiences, and specifically me with the lamp incident in my room, that he started to think something was actually wrong with the house. My brother worked late nights and would get home around midnight. He would walk through the dark house to get to his room and would often hear someone calling his name. He thought it was our mom, and would go into her room to see what she wanted, only to find her asleep. Eventually, he would rarely sleep there. He would sleep at his friends' or his girlfriend's houses instead. My sister and I shared a room. We had the female ghost dressed in black veil who would stand and watch us in the corner of our room. One night, my sister woke up to find someone sitting beside her on her bed holding her hand. She thought it was me and asked what I was doing. No answer. She looked over at my bed. I was there, sound asleep. She looked back and the figure was gone. To this day, she sleeps with her head under the covers and her arms tucked under her. My mom had multiple experiences. I'm not even aware of all of them, and honestly, I don't want to know. I know she said there were at least 5 spirits in the house, plus others that would pass through. In our basement, we had an old cold room, and this apparently is where the spirit portal was located in our house. Not sure why it was there or how it got there, but I think previous residents had dabbled in things that they shouldn't have. As I said previously, there was a hotel that had burned down at that location, killing several people. I think previous residents could sense the presence of these spirits, and dabbled with Ouija boards or seances to contact the spirits, and ended up inviting dark entities. Just a theory, but I believe people who lived there before us made the situation worse. My mom is very sensitive to spirits, and had experiences with all of them, I think. The woman in black was a protective spirit who would communicate with my mom quite a bit. I believe that spirit protected me from the other spirits also. My mom was walking down the basement one day and she lost her footing and started to fall. She suddenly felt hands on her chest and pushed her back up to an upright position. She never saw anyone, just felt them catch her as she fell. Another day she was vacuuming in my brother's room when the phone rang. She ran downstairs to answer it, and while she was downstairs she heard the vacuum start up and being pushed across the floor. She ran back upstairs, but by the time she got there it had stopped. She was the only one home at the time. We had so many issues with phantom calls in that house. This is before cell phones, so we only had a landline. The phone would ring constantly and nobody would be on the line. Or we would hear static, or as though there was a muffled voice on the line, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. I don't know how many times we had the phone company come to check it out, only to find nothing wrong. Then it escalated. My dad would get up to leave for work in the middle of the night, and just after he would leave we would get a call where the person would say, "I saw blank leave for work." This freaked my mom right out, so the police became involved to try and trace where these calls were coming from. We had to keep track of the time the calls came in, what was said, if anything, etc. They never were able to trace the calls. We moved shortly after and had the same phone number. The calls stopped as soon as we moved out, and we never had issues again. Before we moved, my mom was really worried that they would follow us. The woman in black was very religious, and my mom had an old Bible beside her bed. One morning she woke up to find the Bible open beside her on the nightstand, and these words were highlighted: "And this house will be my home forever." Thankfully they didn't follow us. I'm very sensitive to spirits and have had other experiences throughout my life, but that will be for another day. I hated that house and was so happy to move. I'm grateful for the experience though, because now I know our spirits do continue on after death, just in a different way. Hi, my name is Dominic. I'm a 15-year-old kid that lives in a small town in Texas. Keep in mind that this has stuck with me since it happened, and I'm still confused today. I'd like for anyone to try and give me the best explanation as possible, and let me know what you think. So back in about 2012, I was about 6 years old. We lived in a house in Abilene, Texas. So turns out, also I learned all this house info years later, the house was placed on an old cemetery and it was haunted. Well, on this exact date that I remember, it was May 5th, 2012 at 9:20 p.m. I went to sleep and started dreaming. The dream was my siblings in our bunk bed. The way our house was built, there was this short hallway to our rooms and ours was in the very back. The front of the room faced directly across the hallway to my parents' room. Down at the end, on the right in the hallway, there's a bathroom, and in the middle there was another room, on the left, and a closet on the right. Well, it was dark all the way down to the end of the hallway, and all the lights that were on in the whole house was the living room lights. Everywhere else was black, and you could barely see into the rooms. I remember I jumped out of bed, and all of my siblings raced to the end of the hall. I remember I was the last one out of the room. There's 3 things that I saw at once. 1, I looked into my parents' room across the hallway, and I saw a shadow in the window. 2, I saw my siblings at the end of the hallway all of a sudden. Last, I felt a gravity pin me against the wall. I tried to move and scream, but I couldn't. I was pinned against the wall and I couldn't talk. I looked to the right into our room, and we had a short dresser, maybe like 2.5 feet tall. And on it, we had a box television, like one of the big old ones. I was able to hear everything. The TV started playing this very disturbing but extremely clear-sounding orchestra sound. And on the TV, in a somewhat big green font, it said these exact words: This was not an escape from your hell. I looked left into my parents' room and I saw the shadow again, except I saw it very slowly creeping up to the end of their room, and is across their room, staring at me pinned against the wall. I remember that I saw the shadow and I looked down the hall and they were gone. The light in the living room shut off and it was dead silent. Not a single thing was making noise. I heard a whisper. I can't remake what it fully said. It was something like, "I have blank, and it's over." And I spin my head to the area the shadow was staring at me still. And the moment I looked, it flew into my face, and the last image was a cloudy cloak and huge white eyes like pearls going into my vision. Once it got to a distance to where I saw black, I woke up. I was sweaty and it was disturbing. I didn't know what it meant, so I played it off like a normal scary dream. Then, exactly 4 years later, on May 5th, 2016 at 9:20 p.m., I for some reason remembered everything. Then I started piecing everything together, and I realized that it wasn't just a nightmare. It seemed more like the dead trying to communicate with me. And fast forward almost 10 years later, and I have no answers to what that dream meant. Now keep in mind that I'm not into seances or dark magic or Ouija board things. I believe in afterlife and I believe in ghosts. And my dad and I are pretty theoretical people. We believe in a lot of strange occurrences that happen around the world daily. Again, I've never had a personal experience of an unknown entity person that I have memory of. Now we live in the same house. Same year, but a few months later after this dream happened, my parents, including my siblings, swear that I would talk to and play with an unknown entity in our kitchen. I have absolutely no memory of this whatsoever. So many things I've heard of, and yet I have no memory of it at all. All of this is unexplained and has definitely left a huge dent in my mind, wondering what it is, and we will never find out unless the future withholds a bad experience that awaits for me. I pray that this unknown entity doesn't reach my kids when I grow up. Also, this is my first time ever using Reddit, and I just really felt like I wanted to tell the world and get this off my chest. Again, if anyone has any possible explanation to this, I would gladly appreciate it if you let me know. Thank you all. These are my personal experiences. I will try to put them in chronological order based on the age that I was at the time of the incidents. But some of the stories are intertwined, stretched out over decades, and include 3 countries and 2 continents. First, I would like to start by saying that I can remember things from my very early childhood with great detail. By the age of 18 months, I spoke, walked, and was potty trained. I have freaked out my parents, family members, and random people multiple times over the years, without knowing why. And it all boils down to family secrets. I got the, "It's impossible for you to remember this. Somebody told you about it." A lot. Other times they would want to bring me to the priest or church, or told me to stop lying and making stuff up. You know, the classic stuff. So here we go. When I was around 4 or 5, my grandmother, father's mother, I have her name, took me to the market. On our way back, I saw a group of women seated on the front porch of a neighboring house, and they seemed pleasantly surprised to see us. I heard one of the women say, "Is that Mary?" All of the women looked at us and started calling our name excitedly, but my grandmother didn't react, and it started to upset the women, especially the oldest one in the group. She could not believe that we weren't stopping to respond, as was the etiquette. Which was weird, even to little old me at that point, because we lived on the countryside, and everyone knows everyone, if you know what I mean. So I asked her, "Grandma, why aren't you greeting the women?" My grandma looks around confused. "What women?" Me pointing at them. "There." Grandma, while looking straight at them. "Where?" Me, still pointing at them. "There, they called your name." Grandma, "Sweetie, no one has lived in that house for a long time. What do they look like?" Me, There are aunties and grandmothers. 4 to 5-year-old me describing the scene while my grandmother became more and more freaked out with every word that came out of my mouth. And they wear black clothes. Before I could finish my sentence, she grabbed my hand and started running like we were being chased. When we arrived at the house, she was quite shaken. When my father came home, she immediately pounced on him and told him what I had said. She looked terrified. They started whispering for a couple of minutes. My father dismissed her completely. He even went as far as to yell at her that this is nonsense, and that 4-year-old me didn't need to be seen by a priest or a doctor. I never saw those women again, and didn't mention it again until about 15 years later. I left my country at the age of 9 and returned when I was 19. It was already a month after Grandma Mary's passing. Never got a chance to say goodbye. I walk into the house, look to my left, and there on the wall, on a small old black and white photograph, the women that I had seen so long ago. I turn excitedly to my father, who was right behind me, and say, "Dad, look, that's the women I was talking about when I was little. The ones Granny freaked out about. Who are they?" He looks at me in disbelief and says, "They're your grandmother's mother, sisters, aunts, and cousins. But sweetheart, these women were all dead decades before you were born." Me looking straight into his eyes. "I know what I saw and heard that day. You said this and Granny said that. And then you made me promise not to worry and upset her with this stuff. Dad, I need to tell you something." Me. "Okay." "Dad, your godfather, my father's old brother, says stuff like that, and he is schizophrenic. She was afraid that you were too." Me. "Dad, I'm not delusional or schizophrenic, and I have the paperwork to prove it. I've been in therapy the past 3 years, and I think someone would have noticed, don't you think?" "Dad, I don't know. Maybe you like to make stuff up like your mom. My mother was a narcissist and the reason I was in therapy, but we hadn't figured it out till that point yet. We just thought that she was a pathological liar." Me. "What else needs to happen, Dad, for you to believe me?" Boy, I came to bitterly regret asking that question. Part 2. We were renting a house near my grandparents'. It was a new build. We were the first to move in, and to be honest, knowing what I know now, we were probably the reason that house has become haunted. Everyone that moved into that house after us had horrible things happen to them, from uncalled violence, divorces, and even people unaliving themselves. 7-year-old me playing in that house when I hear a voice telling me, "Your grandfather died." I turn to look at my parents when all of a sudden the phone rings. Before my father can reach the landline, I yell, "Daddy, Daddy, Grandpa is dead," meaning his father. He looked at me dismayed and told me to bite my tongue. He picked up the receiver and said hello, and then he looked at me. His eyes became big, and the only thing he said while on the phone was, "When?" "Okay, I'll be right there." At this point, my mother comes into the room and asks my father what's wrong. He looks at her, looks at me, and says, "It was my mother. My father just passed, and she wants me to go close his eyes." They both looked at me, and I felt scared because I thought I was in trouble for saying it out loud. You see, except for the voices and the people that no one else saw, there were times where I felt something invisible pushing me, or tripping me as I walked. I told my parents, but I got the same response. I was lying, and I was a bad child for making stuff up. The same year, I was sitting in my room when I got a very overwhelming feeling of missing my older brother. I started crying, and my parents rushed to see what was wrong with me. When I told them that I wanted my older brother, they looked at me with confusion and told me that I don't have an older brother, and they tried to explain to me that for me to have an older sibling, they would have to be born before me. I started screaming, "I'm not talking about my younger brother. I want my older brother who is alive." The look on my parents' eyes was horror, confusion, and disbelief. They turn their backs to me and start fight whispering with each other. The few things I heard were, my dad say, "What did you tell the child?" Mom, "Nothing, I swear." Dad, "Stop lying. What did you say?" Mom, "Are you insane? I haven't said a thing to anyone." And then, of course, they told me to stop lying and making things up. I stayed in my room crying. Why were they not believing me? Why? I felt desperate. I felt so alone. I begged with every cell in my body for someone, anyone to help me. And then it happened. It felt like a sensation of calmness washed over me. All those emotions of desperation, pain, loneliness, they all disappeared. And I didn't care if they believed me or not after that. She had attached herself to me and hasn't left my side ever since. She would be described to me years later by a psychic who I happened to meet through a friend. But that's another story. And yes, I have seen her. But that's also further down in the story. Here comes the part about the family secrets again. I have an older half-brother from my father. He is 15 years or so older than me. I also would have a younger brother, but my mother had a miscarriage. I found out the truth 2 decades later, after my father died from a close friend of his. Now I know you'll say this is not a ghost story, but trust me, this is all relevant. As I said in part 1, it's all connected. Things turned for the worse over time. It was as if rage was all that we felt in that house. No one was safe, not even visitors. Things would go missing or be broken somehow, and of course I was blamed every time. One day I was talking to our neighbor and landlord. He was in his late 60s, and a very lonely, peaceful guy, when I felt the need to check on my parents. Something told me to go back to the door. The door had glass panels, and you could see into the kitchen. The first time I looked, my parents were chatting, so I played peekaboo with them through the door for a few minutes and left. But something told me to look again, and what I saw was horrific. I watched as my father beat my mother with a hammer over the head, while she lay on the floor with her hands over her head. Blood everywhere, and I screamed so loud that my father stopped. But when he looked at me, what I saw in his eyes was not human. The neighbor ran to get me, saw what happened, picked me up in his arms, and rushed me to his yard. A moment later, I watched in horror as our front door was open and my father dragged my mother, who was a bloody mess, out of the house by the hair down our driveway. Outside the gate was a man that I didn't know, and he was looking at us, laughing his heart out and really enjoying himself. But nobody seemed to notice him. I thought to myself, what an evil person he was for amusing himself with our pain. At that point, the ghost looked to me like regular people. I couldn't tell the difference. I was 7, for God's sakes. After this experience, I shut down, and I didn't see any ghosts or hear any voices or whispers, at least for the next decade. But that all changed when I moved to America. Just to clarify, I didn't grow up in an abusive environment. I had a really great childhood, and I was a happy and content child. I was spoiled by my family and relatives, and even though we weren't rich, we were in a good place. And to this day, I consider my father's family's house as my one and only home. My father could never explain what had happened that day, and it ate at him until it manifested as cancer and took him to the grave. I used to live with my mom and her ex-boyfriend in a really big house. It was around 6,000 square feet, and it gave me bad vibes from the very start. Whenever I voiced it to my mom and her ex, they would just brush it off and tell me that I was just imagining things. They were always traveling and going places, while I had to stay behind because of my job. I was okay with this. I enjoy being alone. I was around 19, and after my friends had left for the night, I did my nightly rounds through the house. I would always check to make sure that all the doors were locked and the lights were all off. Once I made sure of that, I went to my bathroom to get ready for bed. My bedroom was the only one on the main floor. It was a 4-bedroom house, meaning there were 3 upstairs, one being directly over my room and a bathroom. My room and bathroom are separated by a small hallway, which can be closed off by a sliding door, meaning there was a door to my bedroom and to my bathroom, which I always left open because I could close off my little hallway. I start washing my face, and as I'm doing so, I hear what sounds like footsteps directly above me. I freeze in place and listen. They stopped. I shrug it off and continue. It's late. I'm just hearing things. and go back to washing my face. Then it happens again, this time a little louder. Again, I freeze. I know I'm not just hearing things, but what can I do? They stopped and I went back to washing my face. Then it happened again. I stop again, and then I hear and feel one of the loudest bangs that I've ever heard in my life. Imagine a 400-pound person jumping off a bed onto the ground. That's what I heard. I felt the rumble. If that wasn't enough, right after that, my bedroom door slams shut. I'm freaking out at this point and run into my room to grab my machete, thinking someone is in my house. I then run into the kitchen yelling, "Whoever is in my house, I will effing kill you." I have soap still dripping down my face onto the ground. Seeing that all the doors are still locked, I run back into my bedroom to rinse my face off quickly. I pack up my bag and call my best friend. I tell him what's happening and he tells me to get the F out of there. So I keep him on the phone as I finish packing up my bag and get outside to my car. As I'm pulling out of the driveway, I notice something upstairs. Every single light is turned on. I know for a fact that they weren't on 20 minutes before when I checked everything. I didn't even think twice. I just kept reversing and didn't look back at the house. I've seen enough scary movies to know that there would have been a figure in one of the windows staring at me. I went back the next day to see if someone did actually break in. There was no sign of forced entry. All the doors were still locked and nothing was missing. All of the upstairs lights had also been turned off. Fast forward 6 months and we move out. My mom then tells me that the house was turned into a hospice after the original owner from the 1930s was widowed and got lonely. She turned the house into a place for those with no family to die peacefully and not alone. This story takes place in my childhood home, a farm home that housed more than the living. This was one of the experiences that still gives me chills. If you walked into this house, you'd see the efforts made to have it feel homely. The floor-to-ceiling windows that let in great amounts of natural light. The perfectly worn-in couches and the happy family pictures hung on the walls. But if you stayed long enough, you'd realize why most of the family dreaded even a day trip there. I, about 7 at the time, had a bedroom tucked in the very end of the hall. I'm sure most of you have gotten up to get a drink in the middle of the night, right? Simple. You just sneak out of your room and tiptoe to your kitchen trying to not to wake up your mom and dad. For me, it was much different. First, I needed to muster up the courage just to pull my covers off my head. Then I would look down at the floor and run through the hallway till I reached the opening to the living room. I looked down when I ran to make sure that I never glanced accidentally into the bathroom. See, the bathroom was at the opposite end of the hallway, and the door was almost always left open. Inside the door, the mirror on the vanity would show me everything behind me as I came through the hallway. After I saw an apparition of a woman behind me once, smiling with the most eerie smile you could imagine. That is the only way that I would ever walk down that hallway again. After the hallway came the living room. I'd walk quickly through the kitchen. The kitchen had a big center island that you would walk around to get to the fridge and the sink. The fridge had a water and ice dispenser on it, which had a light that turned on when you pressed your cup against the trigger that made it dispense. To my right was the sink, and in front of it, in the dark, sat what looked to be a black garbage bag. I grabbed my cup out of the cupboard next to me, and right as I lifted the water to the water dispenser, I heard faint sobbing sounds. I tried to brush it off and started to fill my water cup. As soon as the light comes on, it illuminates the room. I look over to the sink, and the bag that I had seen was now gone. I remember jerking my hand away from the fridge unintentionally out of fear. As I did, the light went off, and the bag was back, except more defined. Now I could tell it was a dark shadow curled up in an upright fetal position. I heard the sobbing again, and immediately ran back to my room. I remember that night having a dream about a woman who had lost her baby. The baby got sick and passed away in its sleep, and the woman shortly after hung herself in the old shed at the far end of the property. I have no way to confirm this, but I believe the shadow that I saw was her, and the dream that I had was her way of telling me her story. From then on out, I'd see this sad shadow woman every night I'd get up, in the same spot, and every time I'd also hear her sobbing, She never moved or even tried to look at me. I think she was a very sad soul, kept captive by the evil spirits that controlled our house. I wish I could have helped her move on, looking back at it now. But at the time, I was just a scared child. My dad's house was built in 1929. Because of this, it has many walls and rooms and dark hallways, and an intensely creepy stairwell to the basement. The basement itself mostly gets good daylight from outside, as there's a window in each room. To start, all my life growing up, I had heard from my siblings that the house was haunted, and my dad liked to tease that in the storage rooms connected to the stairwell, there was an old woman that lived in them. The stairwell to the basement has pale blue, cold concrete stairs, and a sharp corner that takes you from natural light to darkness as you make your way down. In between the levels of the houses, there are 2 storage rooms directly across from each other, with narrow, short doors that are connected by the stairs. They are pitch black, and the doors don't close. The wood beams of the house and the rock is completely exposed, and the floor is uneven. My oldest brother had once brought a Ouija board into the house, and as soon as he did, the kitchen cabinets started opening and slamming on their own. I've heard once you accept a Ouija board from someone, you have to give it away to someone else if you want the spirits to leave. I'm not sure whatever happened to the Ouija board, but I know that all my life I never felt alone in that house. I had never heard anything at first, just always felt like I was being watched. I would also see strange reflections move across turned off TV screens when I was home alone. When I got married, my dad offered up the basement apartment to me and my husband. It had just been remodeled, and it was perfect for us just starting out. Before they remodel, my dad had used it for his fish tanks, storage, and just being by himself. My husband and I's first night in that basement, things felt very off. A heavy atmosphere filled the basement. It was not a friendly presence. It was angry or malicious. I asked my husband if he could bless the house, and he did so. Immediately after the prayer, the atmosphere was lifted, but I still felt this strange energy, like whatever it was still trying to come in. Like, if we opened the door, it would be back. Fast forward 4 to 5 months and I'm pregnant. I often forgot to take my prenatal until late, so we would be in bed with all the lights off when I'd go back to the kitchen to take it. On this particular night, I was in the kitchen, which was adjacent to the tiny living room with a window front door to a tight stairwell. I could see into the stairwell where I stood. There was a completely dark silhouette standing in the stairwell, looking right into my front door. In that moment, I felt the evil, suffocating presence. I felt like it wanted to hurt me and my unborn baby. I reached down to my phone, which had been on the table, and shined my flashlight at the door. I didn't see anything. I wondered if it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, so I turned off my flashlight and focused my eyes on the door again to see if it would still look like someone was standing there. The silhouette was gone. I returned to bed, too scared to speak. Shortly after this incident, I was still pregnant. I was waiting for my husband to get home. The evening light cut through my windows in this familiar orangey-yellow hue. I was in my bedroom right next to the door, and that bedroom window was right by the stairwell. You could always hear when someone was coming downstairs, and with the intense light shining up against the closed blinds, you'd see their legs walking down to the stairwell to the front door. As I sat waiting, doing my makeup in front of the floor mirror, I'm not just a weirdo who sits on the floor waiting for nothing. I saw the familiar shadow of someone coming downstairs and heard heavy footsteps. I thought it was my husband. I peeked my head out the bedroom door, which allowed me to see the windowed front door about 10 feet away. Nobody was there in the stairwell. I jumped to my feet and ran to the door and swung it open, convinced my husband had ducked down beneath the glass to prank me. Nobody was there. I went outside and started looking around desperately, running up the stairs to verify that nobody was pranking me. Nobody would have had enough time to climb the 6-foot wall of the stairwell without me seeing and get out of my view. From when I saw the steps coming down and when I was at the top of the stairs, it was about 30 seconds. My husband pulled into the driveway to see me standing at the top of the stairs confused. I even asked him if he'd seen someone running away from the house, and he said no. After those 2 incidents, I asked my husband to bless the stairwell down to the house, and I never saw anything there again. The last incident is in the stairwell of the house. I would often hear strange knocks on the walls that seemed to follow me as I went upstairs to do laundry. I chalked it up to a lifetime of being creeped out by those stairs and that the plaster walls and concrete stairs were creating noise from my noise. One day, I was in the kitchen cooking dinner and my brother was over. We had a very nosy stepmother, and she would knock on the door from the basement that connected to the inside stairwell and then just come in. Because of her, I put a bell on the door that would jingle from even a gentle knock. So I heard a knock in the bell. My brother and I paused our talking since we both heard it. I yelled "come in" twice, but nobody came in. So I went to the door and opened it. Nobody was there. I asked my husband to bless that stairwell too after that. It was the only thing that stopped the activity. I don't live there anymore, but my brother lives in that basement now, and I like to tell him my experiences and give him the creeps. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I remember going to sleep over at a kid's house. I'll call him Richard. Thought this was a long time ago, so I may be forgetting what his real name is. Their parents were friends with my friends, so we weren't close friends, but I was happy about it. He had what might have been the coolest thing for a kid in the 80s to ever see, a Pac-Man arcade cabinet in his basement. Now, to help you understand this story, you need to understand the layout of the house. This was a raised ranch. You walk in the front door looking at a small set of stairs that lead down to a finished basement area, and a similar set of stairs right next to it going up to the main floor. You could see the kitchen from the landing up the stairs as you entered the house, and to the right was the living room. The left side of the main floor was a hallway to the 3 bedrooms and the bathroom. One was Richard's, where I would be sleeping with another of his friends. I'll call him Michael. But the basement was what I was focused on, because as you went down to the basement family room, there was a hallway that was a small room to the left where the arcade cabinet was. It was a small room covered with brown wood paneling, like all basements in the 80s had. The front door, the coin receptacle, was left open so you did not need quarters. You would just flick the little metal pin to mimic a quarter and play. This is where I wanted to go, but it was time for bed. Now, going into Richard's room, it was covered in WWE wrestling posters and toys. I was not as into them as the two of them were. I had Nintendo, but played with them like little kids do. We ended up staying up very late, much too late because the parents just let us do whatever we wanted, as was also common in the 80s, and it was great. This was also my first real sleepover where we had run of the house. Considering we were 3 boys not being watched, we were not doing anything dangerous. Play wrestling, watching TV in his room, and going to the kitchen for junk. However, we were not playing Pac-Man, yet I thought. At some point, I'm sitting in Richard's room by myself. The two of them left for some reason. I felt a little uncomfortable for whatever silly reason. They were gone a long time. Self-conscious over the fact that I was not close friends with either of them, I asked myself, what are they doing without me? Let me check. I leave the room and walk towards the basement, thinking that must be it. Even if they were not there, I would get to play, so win-win. I walked down the stairs to the basement where it was dark, but bright enough to see. It may have been a full moon or there were outside lights, because I did not need to turn on any lights. I saw the room and saw the hallway where the arcade waits, but then Richard walked out and stood in front of me. He did not say anything and he was in his underwear. This was really uncomfortable because he looked mad, like he did not want me to go down there. I stood at the bottom step, not moving for a while, none of us saying anything. Finally, I figured, okay, you don't want me down here, and went back upstairs to go to bed. I looked up the second set of stairs towards the kitchen. This is where the chill crawled up my spine. Richard and Michael were in the kitchen, getting something to eat, and were up there the whole time. Now, Richard was an only child, and there was no one else in the house other than his mother and father. Their rooms were across the hall from his. There was no other way from the basement to the kitchen other than maybe from outside. They could not have walked past me without me knowing, and there was not enough time to put clothes back on and get back into the kitchen if they were just pranking me. They also did not say anything about what I saw because I said nothing, thinking if they were pranking me, they would have mentioned it. I went into the kitchen and ate some food and went right to bed. Again, if this was a joke, a 7 or 8 year old boy would have said something. I did not say a word to anyone about the kid in the basement, and to this day, I have no explanation for this. This story happened around 2014 in my grandparents' house. In January of 2013, my uncle sadly passed away from cancer in one of the bedrooms of my grandparents' home. Up until around 2012, when my uncle got sick and started living with my grandparents, I stayed at their house almost every weekend to just hang out with them. When my uncle got sick, him and his 2 daughters moved in with my grandparents, so my cousins shared one room and my uncle slept in the other. He was terribly sick, and unfortunately passed away in January 2013 in that bedroom. After he passed, my cousins still lived with my grandparents, so one of them took his old room. This story takes place around February of 2013. The cousin that took my uncle's old room was going out for the night on a Saturday, so I decided to go to my grandparents' house and stay over. Normally I would sleep on the couch, but since she was gone, I decided to take her bed. I definitely did feel a little uneasy sleeping in his old room, but I eventually fell asleep. I don't know what time it was when this happened, but likely around 2 a.m. since nobody else was awake and my grandparents did tend to stay up past midnight to 1 a.m. most of the time. I had a feeling someone was in my room, but it didn't wake me enough for me to fully be aware of what was happening. I felt someone sit on the edge of the bed and kiss me on my cheek. It was so clear as day. I swore it was one of my grandparents. So when I woke up, I asked if anyone had came in my room last night. They both said no. My uncle and I were super close, so I like to think it was him visiting me. Still to this day, my grandma says she will see my uncle in their house from time to time, coming and going from the back door to their bedroom, where his ashes are kept. There's a house in downtown Ventura that is reportedly very haunted. It's a huge old house. My sister met a woman who used to live there. It has 7 bedrooms spread over 4 levels. I'm not sure what the architect type is called, so I'll just describe it as an old wood frame house with an antique ornate style, picturesque, set on the foothill overlooking downtown and the ocean and the Channel Islands. When I lived in the area, the house was vacant. During my frequent late-night walks, I'd sometimes sneak up to the 24 front stairs and peer in the windows or walk around back. Occasionally, I'd bring a date up there to fool around on the porch swing. It was vacant for a long time. My sister told me the house was haunted, and once, when she was visiting the house, a floor lamp suddenly slid across the living room, apparently of its own volition. Startled, she looked at her friend, the woman who lived there, and she kind of shrugged and said that things like that occurred frequently. They would often hear noises from the upper floor. There was another tenant who resided up there, and sometimes they would hear noises, like someone talking or walking around, only to find out later that the tenant was not at home. She eventually moved out, and sometime later I met her and I asked her about the house. She confirmed the lamp story and said that many things happened there and that she moved out because of them. She had hated living there. She said, "Let me show you something." She pulled out her phone and flipped to a photograph of a young man sitting on a sofa in front of a dark picture window, or maybe glass sliding doors. She said that it was her son on the couch. The photo was just kind of a typical random snapshot of a kid sitting on a couch. Also in the photo was a large swirl of white smoke to the right of the kid. It looked like cigarette smoke that had drifted in front of the lens, except when I looked closer, I was startled and frightened by what I had noticed about it. There was a very clearly defined face in the smoke. Not a human face, but one of a creature with an elongated muzzle and head shaped like a canine. The mouth was open, showing large, sharp, pointy teeth. The eyes were fierce and appeared to be looking into the camera. I truly hate to say this because I tend to roll my eyes at stories like this, but it is best described as a dragon or demon face. I don't believe in demons. The image was unmistakable and gave me chills and goosebumps. The woman said that she hadn't seen anything when she took the photo, but it was just a casual snapshot of her son while they were sitting and watching television. She managed to get the landlord to reluctantly let her out of the lease after she told him everything that happened there. Eventually, they found tenants. There were old cars and beat-up motorcycles out front, and junk stored on the porches and balconies, so they didn't appear to be neat, clean, orderly tenants, and the house looked in need of repairs and maintenance. I never met the new residents, but I wonder if they had any experiences in that creepy old house. Nine years ago, during the summer of 2013, my uncle called me one day asking if I wanted to take a road trip to Alaska. We live on the southern tip of Texas, across the Rio Grande from Progreso, Mexico, so I thought he was joking. It takes us 12 hours to get out of Texas from where we're from, so driving to Alaska sounded insane. However, he was not joking, and about a week later I climbed into his dingy 1990 Chevrolet camper van with my two younger cousins, a 13-year-old female and a 10-year-old male. And we headed out on our 3-week excursion. I was a 15-year-old male at the time, a freshman in high school, and excited to see some new parts of the country. It took us about a week and a half to leave the United States, going through northern Washington. Still, by that time, we had been on the road for a while. We were getting a little annoyed being around each other 24/7, and we were generally trying to hightail it through Canada and get back home in a shorter amount of time. After arguing with my younger cousins for a while, I finally managed to fight my way into the front seat because that's where all of us kids wanted to sit. So I officially became the co-pilot. Even though I had an iPhone with GPS, my uncle was an old-school road trip fanatic, so he made whoever was in the front seat use this gigantic atlas book to give him directions as we drove. This night, we had just turned on a Highway 16 in Prince George, Canada, and we were going to be on that road for hours, so I had the atlas open on my lap, but I wasn't looking at it much. It was about 2 a.m., and my uncle decided we would drive through the night to make up some time, so naturally, I stayed in the front seat to keep him company while he went. We were swapping stories and making small talk, and my two cousins passed out in the back seats while driving down this somewhat desolate highway. At one point, while my uncle was telling me a story and I was looking out the window, I became mesmerized by the streetlights as they flew by my passenger side window. It was like I fell into this mindless trance of watching a streetlight go by and mentally counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then another would go by and I'd restart my counting. I did this for several minutes for no reason. Still, something about the perfect yellow illuminated circles the lights would cast against the pitch black asphalt appealed to me, followed by 5 seconds of unrelenting darkness before the next morning would pass. It was soothing. That all changed when I saw the next streetlight coming up from my peripheral vision, but something was standing underneath it. I only had about a second to assess what it was. Still, I saw a petite older woman, maybe 5 feet tall at most, hunched over with a red shawl covering her hair, casting a shadow on her face, and holding a canvas tote bag that looked like it had something heavy inside. I specifically remember that she was wearing an off-white summer dress that went down to about her knees because it was cold outside, maybe about 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and I couldn't believe she didn't have pants on. Now, seeing this woman didn't necessarily alarm me in any way. It was more like I took notice of her and let my imagination take over with, oh man, that's creepy to see a random old lady standing under a streetlight in the middle of the night next to a pitch black forest. About this time, there was a lull in the conversation with my uncle. He had the radio on very low, and I was still staring out of my window, enjoying the hum of the roads as we kept driving. About 20 seconds after we passed that lady, the radio station we were listening to started emitting static and increased in volume, at least enough for my uncle to take notice and turn it down. It was a weird coincidence, but we were driving in a forest, so it didn't surprise me that radio signals could get lost out here. However, what was less explainable was that seconds after the radio went to static, the dashboard lighting that illuminates all the gauges for the driver started flickering on and off for over a minute. This got my uncle's attention, because running into an electrical issue at night would be a nightmare. As the lights are flickering, we see a sign that says fuel 1 mile ahead, or something to that effect. So he says, "Hey, I'm going to pull in and grab a cup of coffee and fill up." He pulls into this well-lit gas station, and we are the only ones there. He starts fueling up and tells me to stay outside with the kids while he goes inside for coffee. So I stand outside the van to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. As I'm standing there, I'm mindlessly looking around, and at some point I start to notice how eerily quiet it is. I hear the faint gurgle of gas pouring into the car from the nozzle. I hear the low hum of the incandescent bulbs that illuminate the pumps. I hear the light tapping of some of the more giant moths smacking into the glass pane covering those bulbs. There is no other noise, however. There are no cicadas in the trees, cars on the road, bats flapping their wings, air blowing. Nothing. It was unsettling enough to understand how entirely alone it was out here. My uncle walks back out, puts the fuel nozzle away, climbs back into the car, uncaps his coffee, and just quietly watches the steam cascade off the top of the liquid. I watched him this whole time because I thought it was a little unusual that he didn't start the car immediately. But then he turned to me with a slightly concerned look and quietly said, "Did you see that woman under the street lamp a few miles back?" I sighed with relief and chuckled softly because his bringing it up verified what I had seen was real. And I said, "Yeah, I did. She was kind of creepy." And he gave me a strange, expressionless smile, like he was trying to portray calm agreement. But it just seemed off. It seemed like something was bothering him that he wasn't telling me. Before I could say anything else, we pulled out of the gas station and headed north on Highway 16 as we were before, but slower now, because he had a massive cup of scalding hot coffee in his hand. And why he insisted on driving without a lid on is baffling to me. I noticed that the radio had returned to broadcasting soft music instead of static, and there wasn't anything wrong with the interior lighting. I told my uncle, "Do you think it was a coincidence that the radio and lights started malfunctioning right after we passed that lady?" He kept his eyes trained on the road ahead, as he grimly said, "Maybe." So, at this point, I figured he was trying to mess with me by making this seem more unnatural or paranormal than it was by taking on this serious tone. I tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Wouldn't it be crazy if we saw her again up the road?" And I got no response. Fine. At this point, I was slightly paranoid, but mostly just confused by my uncle's demeanor. So I opened the atlas and started flipping through the pages to kill time, and maybe find a route for us to take the next day. A few minutes go by. My eyes are focused on the map trying to make out highway numbers in the dim lighting of my cell phone screen. And suddenly, my uncle says, "No effing way." The intensity in his voice made my head snap up to look at him, and I saw pure, unadulterated fear on his face as he looked out towards my side of the windshield and said, "The lady." I whipped my head around to see if he was messing with me again, and I didn't see anything as I looked at the following street lamp in the distance. I looked back and said, "Ha ha, very funny." But he cut me off and frantically said, "I swear to God she was under that street lamp we just passed." Now I was annoyed and concerned because I was terrified of the paranormal at that time. And my uncle was driving, so if he was starting to hallucinate from exhaustion, that was dangerous. Before I could say anything else, he started slowing down and whipping the van around to start heading back down the road from where we just came. And I said, "What the hell are you doing?" And he didn't say a word. His eyes were locked on the side of the road where he had seen this lady. Right then, like clockwork, the radio goes to static again. This sent violent shivers down my spine. I was uncomfortable with what was happening, and it was physically impossible for this lady to have moved ahead of us down the road then. It was at least 5 miles back from where we saw her the first time, and it had not even been 20 minutes. Not to mention that not a single vehicle passed the gas station in either direction the entire time I was there, so she would have had to have sprinted 5 miles in 20 minutes without me noticing her pass the gas station. Impossible. As my uncle slowed down in front of the street lamp where he had seen her, the lights on the dashboard started flickering again, and I felt an overwhelming wave of nausea. I just had a visceral fear of the situation and didn't hide it. I pleaded with my uncle to please turn the van around without stopping, so we could get as far away from here as possible, but he was unrelenting. He scoured the wood line with the headlights trying to find this woman again, but there was no sign of anything. I put my face in my hands and leaned forward to escape for a couple of seconds, because I honestly didn't want to find out if she was there. Right then, through the radio static, we all froze for a few seconds as we heard a crackly, disembodied voice say, "Patricia, help." At that point, I started crying. It was too much. There were no more coincidences or explanations for what was happening. I wish I could have passed out from fear to avoid what I saw next. After what felt like an eternity, but was about 2 minutes, he could not find her, so he started to turn the van around, but this time he did a slower 3-point turn like he was defeated and almost disappointed. I looked back up from my hands, happy to know that we would move past this, until he made the final slight turn to start heading back north again, and I almost threw up. She was standing on the side of the road, right effing there, no more than 20 feet in front of the van. My uncle let out an F-bomb loud enough to wake up the kids, whom I had forgotten were in the back by this point. So when I heard a faint female's voice say, "What's wrong?" from right behind me, I had to summon all my willpower to keep myself from pissing myself. I screamed like a child and jumped high enough to hit my head on the van's roof, closely followed by my cousin's blood-curdling scream once she noticed the lady on the road. The inside of that car was pure chaos for about 10 seconds. It wasn't until we both noticed that my uncle had not floored it yet that she said, "Papa, drive." I could not have agreed more with that statement. He had just started pressing down on the pedal when this woman, in the most inhuman and contorted movements, lifted her head just high enough for the streetlight to illuminate her completely blank, stark white face. There was nothing on it. No mouth, no eyes, no nose. It had deep, shadowy wrinkles and 2 shallow recesses where the eyes should be. I started gagging. My cousin started bawling uncontrollably. The younger male cousin let out the most pitiful and fearful moan I've ever heard. And finally, my uncle floored it. I had this deep sense of dread that, at that moment, the van would eventually shut down. And at that point, I would probably die from fear. It didn't, however. We peeled out of there as fast as the old van let us, and we just drove. We drove in stone-cold silence, not saying a word to each other, not looking at each other, and just praying for morning to come so we could try to forget what we had just witnessed. None of us ever talked about that night after that. The rest of the trip seemed to go by quickly, but it was different. There was a palpable tension between us, just wanting to return home and forget everything. On our way back, we made it a point to drive down Highway 16 in the middle of the day, speeding the entire time. I had kept a daily journal of our trip, so I could go back and reminisce years later, but I didn't write anything about that night because I knew I would never forget it. I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't until years later when I became interested in true crime podcasts and narrators on YouTube telling scary stories that everything changed. I was driving home from Austin alone one day, nothing unusual for me, and I was listening to some serial killer podcast. I had no idea which killer they were talking about at the time. Still, during the 2 hosts' banter about how this killer would target women and then dump their bodies along the highway, the other host said, "That kind of reminds me of that one highway in Canada where the same thing happened. You know, they call it the Highway of Tears or something. I think it was Highway 16 or 17 or something." When I heard him say Highway 16, I nearly crashed my truck because my arm holding the wheel jolted as I got a rush of fear through my entire body. I immediately pulled over on the side of the road and Googled Ghosts of Highway 16, only to stumble on this article. I have honestly never felt that sick in my entire life. I had long since pushed that memory out of my mind, so it never even occurred to me to research if other people had similar experiences on that stretch of road. Even if it had happened to me, I don't think I would have wanted to search for it, because it would have made the experience more authentic. It took me 5 separate attempts to get through that article, because the first time, I felt tears welling up in my eyes as soon as I saw the highway photo. That was my last road trip with my uncle and cousins. When I'm in my hometown driving around at night, I have perpetual anxiety that on some lonely street she might reappear. And this time, I won't have anyone there with me. Now, I don't know if Patricia is one of the victims of that highway, or someone to whom a victim was calling out for help, but I don't intend to research any further. May she and anyone else who met that fate rest in peace. But if not, who knows? My husband works at the Oregon State Hospital, a facility infamous for its past treatment of mental illness and where the classic film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was shot. Despite its dark past, the facility had become a place of healing for many individuals suffering from mental illnesses. However, as with many older buildings, a portion of the asylum was scheduled to be demolished. As part of his cleaning duties, my husband ventured into the abandoned portion of the building, which had been devoid of any human activity for a considerable length of time. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. During his lunch break, he decided to call me to check in. When I answered the phone, I could hear what sounded like people talking in the distance. However, the voices were muffled and indistinct. He sounded distracted and didn't seem to be listening to anything I was saying. Irritated, I snapped at him and asked if he was calling to talk to me or them. My husband was confused and quickly replied that he was alone in the building. My heart sank as I realized that something wasn't right. There was a panic in his voice that I had never heard before in our 19 years of marriage. After that experience, my husband was understandably shaken, but he continued to work at the asylum. He never had another experience like that again, but the memory of that day still creeps us out. When my cousin's son was little, he was super attached to his imaginary friend named Joseph. He would take Joseph everywhere and do things like demand that his parents buckle him into the car, so he was definitely more attached than most kids. But some kids just have really realistic imaginary friends, so they didn't think it was anything weird. Fast forward several years. My cousins have moved out of that house and their son is a lot older. One day, my dad runs into the family, who had bought the house from them, who has a little boy of their own. As the conversation goes on, it gets brought up that the little boy who lives in the house now has an imaginary friend he is super attached to named Joe. Obviously, my cousin tells the family about his son who had his imaginary friend named Joseph while living in that same house. It's interesting, but ultimately assume it's just a funny coincidence. Fast forward again to the present day. The last family moved out of the house, and for several years it sat vacant. Recently, someone bought the house and renovated it. One day, my cousin ran into the guy who was renovating it. They live in a small town. It's not weird that he keeps seeing the people who bought this old house. They were talking about the noise, and my cousin mentioned the funny coincidence about the two boys having an imaginary friend with a similar name. At that point, the guy doing the renovations tells my cousin that while they were taking out a wall in the house, they found an old journal that had the name Joseph written on either the cover or first page. Unfortunately, I don't think they kept the journal, but at the very least, it's a very spooky coincidence. So, I'm a pretty skeptical person when it comes to the paranormal, albeit having a vested interest in tales and evidence. I'm the kind of person who browses ghost hunter videos on YouTube and these kinds of subreddits. I've also visited plenty of purportedly haunted locations in the US, including, but not limited to, places like the Omni Parker House in Boston, Molly Brown House in Denver, the Whaley House in San Diego, Alcatraz at night, and the Winchester House more than once, none of which have yielded any sort of evidence. A part of me wants to believe, but I'm also terrified at the prospect of witnessing something. I was mostly a non-believer up until a couple of months ago. In short, I had wanted to plan a surprise party and getaway for my girlfriend's 30th birthday. She had mentioned wanting to go hit the slopes. It was January, so it's still winter at this point. I organized this months ahead and had invited some of her closest friends to join. I ended up renting an Airbnb cabin that had enough rooms to house 10 people, or 5 couples. One entire lower floor basement level with 2 beds, a room on the first floor, and 3 rooms upstairs. Also adding that this cabin was in a beautiful rural neighborhood in Tahoe, California, with tons of cabins next door, down the street, adjacent, etc. So there's plenty of housing around us. Nothing peculiar about it, and there are other people staying around. Of course, my girlfriend and I take the master bedroom upstairs, and right across the hall is another couple in one room, and my girlfriend's cousin by herself in the 3rd room next door. All rooms are taken, and the middle floor is a lively area with games, a fireplace, and a foosball table. These details are somewhat relevant and important later in my story. The first night was a night of merry drinking and games. To celebrate the occasion, we had decorated the living room and blown up balloons to be loosely strewn around the large and cozy living room and family room where we imbibed. Almost uneventful with respect to weird happenings. Except towards the end of the night, balloons would randomly pop at odd intervals. Someone in our group suggested it was the balloons getting attracted towards the heater vents and popping. I was dismissive of this because not all of them that popped were congregated near vents. Cool, I just took note. Didn't want to argue or suggest anything weird at this point. After we all retired for the night and the lights were off, we could hear balloons pop downstairs at random intervals that reverberated through the silent house. This happened between 2 to 3:30 a.m. The next morning, still plenty of healthy balloons strewn about. Fast forward to night 2. After we returned from snow activities, we prepped for drinking and the usual. After a full day's worth of shredding the snow, we are all collectively tired a bit earlier than the previous night and decide to retire at around 11:30 to midnight. Here's where I personally experienced things that got me feeling irked. Since it was cold, I decided to go downstairs to turn on the thermostat and heater. Our couple friends across the hall had their door slightly open. Lights were on, and bathroom was in use. As I'm going downstairs in the dark stairwell, I hear the floorboards behind me creak and figured it was my friend coming out to follow me for a cup of water or go to the kitchen. As I walk across the living room and stop at the thermostat, the lights are still off at this point and the creaks continue. And then I hear it stop a few feet behind me near the kitchen. The kitchen lights don't turn on, and I hear nothing else. Feeling like he was waiting behind me, and I was being watched, I said, "What's up, dude? Need something?" I turn around and nobody was there. I've only ever read about this dreadful feeling of being watched, and it is indeed every bit dreadful upon realization in person. A minute ago, I swore someone followed me down. I was taken aback, and my skeptical self once again took note and spoke nothing of it. I go back upstairs. About 30 minutes pass and it's still cold. At this point, everyone is asleep, and I decide to turn up the thermostat a couple notches. Nothing crazy. I turn on the upstairs hallway light bright enough to light the steps to see from downstairs. I proceeded to head downstairs and stop once again at the thermostat. No floorboard creaks except for my own steps this time. As I'm turning up the thermostat and thinking to myself how odd the creaking was the first time, a noise broke my train of thought. I hear the ball from the foosball table several feet away near the fireplace audibly roll across its surface and hit one of the sidewalls. Nobody is around, and I certainly am too far to touch it. I froze in fear and hastily go back upstairs to sleep, not knowing how to mentally process the increasingly evident occurrences. I eventually sleep under the pretense that nothing is definitive enough for me to be conclusively sure that this cabin is haunted. I don't mention or wake anyone up about my experiences. The next morning, as we leave and drive back home, the balloons were brought up by my girlfriend's friend/couple who stayed across the hall. I took this as an opening to talk about my experiences and disclosed them. At this point, my girlfriend's friend goes pale, gets serious, and tells us that the previous night she was wide awake when she noticed a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. She states that she went into panic mode after blinking and realizing it wasn't a dream or hallucination, and shook her boyfriend awake. who I thought followed me down the stairs earlier that night, only to have it disappear. This by far, coupled with my experiences, is undeniable evidence. I myself was wide-eyed upon hearing this solid piece of information. My girlfriend's cousin, who stayed in the room next to us, then mentions she heard what sounded like breathing in her room, but dismissed it as naturally occurring sounds of the walls in the cabin. These events standalone could be nominal and may be explained, but collectively, it's hard to deny that something was present and amiss. I'm hoping that this is the extent of my run-ins with the paranormal, because I don't want to experience anything like this again. The universe has made me more of a believer. I love walking in the woods, but some strange things have happened in the woods. Have you had anything weird happen to you? This was one of the strangest things that happened to me. It was a beautiful day for a hike in the woods, so I grabbed my backpack and set out on the trail. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the leaves rustled gently in the breeze. As I walked deeper into the forest, I noticed that the sounds of nature had grown quieter. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I saw her. A woman dressed in white, standing at the edge of a clearing. She looked like she was from another time, with a long flowing dress and a ribbon tied around her waist. At first, I thought she might be lost or in trouble, so I approached her cautiously. But as I got closer, she vanished into thin air, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves behind. I was shaken, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to follow her. So I continued on the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the clearing where I had seen the woman, I heard the faint sound of music. It was a haunting melody, played on a violin. I stepped into the clearing and saw her again, the woman in white, dancing to the music of an unseen player. She twirled and spun, her dress billowing in the breeze. But then, as suddenly as before, she vanished again, leaving me alone in the clearing. I left the woods that day feeling haunted by the memory of the ghostly woman in white. I never saw her again, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by something not quite of this world. I genuinely believe that I myself, not the areas I've lived in or have been to, am haunted. I wish this could be shorter, but there's a whole lot to say, and I'd appreciate some feedback. I also know that this community doesn't like sleep paralysis stories, but I know that mine weren't just sleep paralysis, but were paranormal encounters. As a kid, I went through a lot. It really messed me up when my dad left my mom, and it made me feel really unsafe. I don't know why, but I've felt like something has been after me my whole life. No BS. I was strangely aware of death from a very young age, and it terrified me to even think of my family members dying. And I'd have terrible nightmares about awful things happening to my brother, dad, or mom starting at age 6 that I can remember. I've also had sleep paralysis my entire life, but didn't know what it was until a few years ago. I also realized that the stories I mention here weren't really sleep paralysis, but real encounters. I do have sleep paralysis on occasion, but it's nothing like what I describe here. So on one hand, I was scared to fall asleep because of my awful nightmares, and on the other, I was terrified of seeing the things I saw then and still see today. I had 2 windows in my room, one behind my bed and the other next to my bed. I kept my curtains open because the streetlight made me more comfortable falling asleep than my nightlight, as all of my nightlights I had would mysteriously lose battery life after a few days, and would flash randomly on and off throughout the night and day or make random clicking noises. I remember so clearly as it happened frequently from when I was maybe 7 to age 12 when we moved out of that house, seeing a figure outside of my window, a moving figure, usually as dark as the night and in some sort of robe. Looked a lot like the ghost of Christmas Future. And this same figure occurred in many of my nightmares as well. It usually just planted a hand on my window or started banging on it, and continued to do so until I fell asleep. Other times I'd wake up to my sleep paralysis. I genuinely saw the figure in the window, because it always was before I fell asleep and never woke me up in the middle of the night, so I know that it wasn't just sleep paralysis, and I could move just fine. And a similar figure, dark but not robed and usually donned a wide-brimmed hat, stood in the center of my room. He usually reached out to me, but other times he just stood there watching, even though I couldn't see if he had eyes. That was when I was a child and I lived in that house. That was pretty much all the creepy stuff that happened there, and yet I didn't really believe in ghosts until I was 13. The problem is, I'm pretty sure that I'm the one that's haunted. My mom's apartment, after we moved from our previous house, which was new and no one had died in it, so it was very mysterious that I had these experiences, is old as hell. This apartment was originally built in 1920 and was only recently barely restored. It has its problems, like leaky ceilings and bugs, but that's about it. But maybe the first time I experienced anything there was when I was 13. My room was really messy in the farther half of my room, where my TV was set up. Very strangely, the two cats we had would not go past the front half of my room, towards my closet and TV. I was really curious about it one time and set my cat carefully in front of my TV, where she screeched. That's not something she ever did, and sprinted out of my room. She was obsessed with me and mostly spent her time in my room, but only in the front half where my bed was. My mom even peeked in at her meowing at the TV one time when I was at my dad's. Then one night, I had gotten ready for bed and was about to lie down when I noticed the light coming from the other half of my room. My DVD player was on, and I hadn't used my TV or the DVD player in months, and it hadn't been on just 30 minutes prior. So what the hell happened? I knew very well that the cats wouldn't go near it, so I went to turn it off, and the DVD player has this little screen on it that says what it's doing. Things like searching, ejecting, turning off. But this time it said something that I've never even seen it say before. Controls. It turns out that you can click on the settings button of the DVD player and click a few more options to get to the screen where it would say that. But I didn't press those buttons and neither did the cats. So I turned it off and strangely fell asleep just fine. Little things have happened in my mom's apartment since, but nothing that could be clearly described as a paranormal occurrence. Until the last few years. I changed my room around in my mom's apartment when I was 16. I got a bigger bed and put it on the wall in that far half of my room where the TV used to be, and I put the TV in the front half of my room. The first thing I noticed was in my old Kinect, which sat on top of the TV. It was a big box TV. I never used the Kinect, but it was connected to the Xbox and would turn on when I turned on the Xbox. I could see the little Kinect icon on my home screen and began noticing figures behind me, where my TV had been and now my bed was, but they didn't move. They were very humanoid, and nothing in my room would make those shapes, let alone show up so prominently on the Kinect. Then came the touching. I began to feel someone touching me all the time. I would lie in bed and feel someone slowly press up against me. I would be in my kitchen and suddenly feel someone touch my back or shoulder when no one else was home. I could even be in school, standing behind my friends with no one else behind me, and feel someone touch my shoulder. That's when I also realized that it wasn't just happening at home. Not to mention my sleep paralysis began to get worse when I slept in my bed after it moved to the paranormal side of the room. But it changed from that figure to other things, like spiders crawling all over me, or a human intruder breaking into my room through my window and reaching in their hand. I could see it, hear it all happening, but no one was there. I can tell now that was real sleep paralysis instead of my paranormal kinds, as they were brief and didn't feel as threatening. My paranormal kind lasted hours and is more ominous than threatening, even as a child. Then came the name calling. You know the feeling you get when someone says your name but they didn't? Now imagine that happening when no one's there. Everywhere I went, school, Dad's house, Mom's house, someone calling my name, usually in my own voice or some man's, but the voice was never creepy. If it was my voice, it sounded like I was screaming my own name. But if it was that man's, it sounded almost loving and caring. But no one was there. But the footsteps creeped me out the most. The footsteps started when my brother left for college, and my mom and I were left in her apartment alone. The footsteps also still happen today. My mom works a crappy schedule at a nearby hospital and goes to bed at around 7 p.m. to wake up at 3:30 a.m. I used to go to bed at around 10. My mom sleeps like crap. She always has and probably always will. So she wakes up in the middle of the night, almost every night. One night when I was 16, I was lying in bed about to fall asleep when I heard pots and pans banging in the kitchen. I was tired and I just assumed my mom couldn't sleep and got up and did the dishes or something. Then I heard footsteps outside of my door and saw a shadow underneath. Kinda weird. My mom had zero reason to come near my door. The next day after she got home from work, I asked her what she was doing the night before. She said she slept great and she didn't get up once. My mom didn't believe in ghosts, at least not spirits that would be around our small town or anything. If it was something bigger and a lot happened there or many people died, that was one thing. But when my mom started hearing the footsteps at night, she started to realize that the stuff I've been saying might not be so crazy after all. She even started asking me if I had gotten up at the night, when I usually slept great and didn't get up at all. Occasionally, we've heard the footsteps and have seen the shadow from underneath our doors together. Occasionally, we walk out just to see if we straight up have an intruder, just to see nothing there, but continue hearing the footsteps go around the house where we're looking. I've heard my mom's voice as if she was talking to someone, when in reality, she was fast asleep. I've seen things out of the corner of my eye, pale creatures on all fours with dark eyes. I've seen that thing out of the corner of my eyes all the time, regardless of where I am. Right before I left for college, I had sleep paralysis again, after not having it for a year. I was laying in my bed and there was a strange bright light pointing towards the dark figure at the end of my bed, with glowing red eyes and a wide-brimmed hat. But for some reason, this time I wasn't scared or even nervous. I had an overwhelming sensation of relief, and the only thought in my normally loud and buzzing head was literally, "Thank God you're here, I've missed you." I then fell asleep right after. I have no idea why I thought that. I hadn't seen this figure so clearly since the night I got my second COVID shot, which was about a year prior, and I was terrified of it then. But this was the only time it had red eyes. I never saw its eyes before. Part of me thinks that this was a new ghost or something, and I have to admit I've been longing for that sense of relief I had when I saw them there at the end of the bed. But part of me is just so damn curious and wonders if this is the same ghost that has had good intentions all along. Then I went to college. Nothing happened for months until I came back after Thanksgiving break, deciding to drop out at the end of the semester. All of a sudden, I'd be in my dorm room and see that pale creature out of the corner of my eye again. All of a sudden, I'd feel the touches when I was lying in my bunk. All of a sudden, I'd hear that man's sweet voice call out my name out of nowhere, and nowhere to be found. Now I'm back home, and my nightmares lately have been particularly bad. My nightmares since I was a kid have always had three themes. I'm being chased, I'm being watched, or something is hurting my family. But my nightmares over the past few months have changed into I'm alone, my family hates me, or someone is after me. Not to mention a single nightmare where my family was possessed, and the only safe place to hide from them was my room. This could have nothing to do with my ghosts or anything, but I also think it's strange that the paranormal occurrences have been happening more often than not now that I'm back home. The footsteps are back, and I hear them almost every night. Last night even, my door cracked open the slightest bit when I was playing a game on my computer. I see the pale creature all the time, peeking around the doorways or scampering at the end of my bed. Frequently, I've felt someone laying beside me, but now instead of being worried, I feel comforted. While the pale figures still terrify me, I genuinely miss that dark figure that I saw at the end of my bed. I wonder if the feeling that someone's laying next to me, in my bed, is the same spirit. I've tried talking to him. I say him because it's a rather overwhelming masculine presence that I feel. But without, actual ghost equipment which may or may not even work, I can't get an actual answer. All I can say is that it doesn't seem that he can move things, but he can hear me. Maybe a week ago, I was laying on my stomach when I felt someone slowly lay across my legs, kind of like a big dog, but my back stiffened. So right when I was about to roll over, I said, "I'm gonna roll over now, but if you want to lay with me, you can after I move." And I rolled over and felt a whole body lay on top of me, to the point that I thought that if I opened my eyes, I would see his face. I opened my eyes, but obviously no one was there. I even looked down at my legs, still feeling numb and feeling the weight of someone on me when no one was there. But it was comforting. I've started calling them my ghostie, since he seems to care about me. I've considered that this could be like a ploy of like a demon or something, but I don't feel drained. Now that I'm back home, I actually feel happier than I've been in my entire life, ghosts and all. I think I could have created an egregore, a spirit that manifests out of mass feelings of sadness or depression, or something from the trauma I had when I was a kid. I was a very depressed little girl, and I remember contemplating offing myself when I was in first grade. But that wouldn't explain why I still have these experiences when I'm happy, and they're even stronger. And what are the pale creatures I see lurking around? I actually see those at my dad's house more often than here at my mom's. But I'll discuss what happened at my dad's place in another post. And why would I start being comforted by the spirit that caused me so much fear and depression in the first place? I'd love to hear what everyone thinks of this. Am I haunted? Or am I just going to coincidentally haunted places? Why would I, specifically, be targeted? This is the part 2 to the previous post. If you've read my previous post, you know that I've had countless paranormal experiences regardless of where I am or who's around me. In part 1, I really only mentioned some things that occurred away from home and at my mom's houses, but I experienced similar and also incredibly different experiences at my dad's, and would love your opinions on this. So my grandfather on my dad's side built a house for his mother when he was in his 20s. She grew old and even died in the living room of that house. When she died, and after my dad left my mom, my dad bought it. He restored it, put in a pool, this and that. My room there was actually her old room before she died. I was 8 when my dad bought that house, so I had plenty of paranormal occurrences prior from living with my mom in her old house. My brother believes in ghosts, but he swears up and down that the only reason he believes, and the only time he's experienced anything paranormal, was in my dad's old house. He refuses, however, to tell us what happened to him while we lived there. Now, I mentioned my great-grandmother's passing, but I know she's not a ghost haunting me or that house. I didn't even know her. That and my spirits all feel very masculine in presence. If one of my ghosts, however, is a poltergeist, I probably acquired it from there. Not much happened at my dad's old house in the grand scheme of things. I lived there, part-time obviously because my parents divorced when I was 5. For the longest time out of any place I've lived, from age 8 to 16. But the few stories I have to tell about this place are significantly scarier to me than my ghostie that I have at my mom's. Not to mention the stuff I've seen at my dad's new place. Stuff moved around, constantly. I'd set my toothbrush on the vanity counter, just for it suddenly to be thrown off. Thrown. I'd see shadows stand in my doorway so often, the same one I usually saw in my paranormal kind of sleep paralysis at my mom's old house, and recently in her apartment. But this time I was wide awake at my dad's. That I had to start shutting my door before I went to bed. I'd hear shuffling from right outside my window, and even though I could see the moonlight coming through my closed curtains, I couldn't see a shadow where a person making those shuffling footsteps would be. I never had sleep paralysis there. Strange nightmares, even considering how crazy my normal nightmares were. But no sleep paralysis ever occurred in that house. The whole energy was different in this house. In my mom's old house, the atmosphere was very lonely, empty. But there at my dad's, all I could feel was danger. That was the more normal kind of ghost stuff. A couple years before my dad sold that house, the second scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life happened. Hell, it didn't even happen to me, but I heard it happen to someone or something else. I was laying in my bed one night, literally just about to fall asleep when I hear a scream across the street. That house was on a street that ran through the middle of the woods, right? And my great aunt lived next door to us. And across the street was an old couple who ran a very small maple syrup business. The next group of houses was much further down the street and separated by a ton of trees. This experience I had has led me to believe in paranormal creatures before I started seeing those pale guys crawling around. Before, I only believed in ghosts. So I heard a scream from across the street. I knew it wasn't the old man who lived across the street, as this absolutely blood-curdling scream sounded like a younger guy. There was only one guy that age that lived on my street, and that's much further down, and passed through loads of trees. Not to mention this guy is very much alive today, and I graduated high school with him. So it's pretty clear that this scream came from no one I knew, and there weren't any missing people in the area. No suspicious things happening. Nothing. No reason for me to hear what I did. So I roll over and turn to my window, but this scream sounded far, like in the woods behind my old neighbor's house. And while I suppose that couple could be murderers, I'd say it's highly unlikely, as they're sweet as can be, and their lights were all out. It stopped, and thinking I might just really be tired, I roll back over onto my back. The screaming started again, this time much worse. If you can imagine someone torturing another person in front of you in the most horrible of ways, this is how that guy would sound. It was awful. It sounded an awful lot like when that one dude disappears in the Blair Witch Project, and you know he's dead, but the witch is impersonating his final screams as she killed him. Awful screams. It brings out this primal instinct to help. But I had this overwhelming feeling to stay right there in bed for my safety as well. It was only a year later that I learned about skinwalkers and how they can impersonate people to draw in their victims. I think this might have been something like that. They also say that the farther away the scream is, the closer the creature is to you, which means that that thing could have been right outside my window after I rolled back over. I heard the scream one last time. The worst of it all, higher pitch, wordless, just moans, heavy breathing and screeching beyond terror. Then it very suddenly stopped, and for some reason I stopped worrying as soon as the screaming stopped and peacefully fell asleep. I seem to sleep the best when some of the scariest stuff happens to me for some reason. I've never asked my family if they heard something similar that night. At that house, I also heard my name whispered a lot, coming from right behind me. This one time I was talking about dogs. The parents left for work, and my brother was in the shower. And as I opened the door, I heard someone whisper my name right behind me. Obviously, no one was there. I asked my brother if he had called me just in case, but he said no. And my name isn't exactly common, so I can't really mistake Elena for the sound the door made as I opened it. That's the only time I've heard a disembodied voice that didn't belong to me or that man that I hear all the time. Okay, now on to the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. My dad was in the process of selling the house. I was 16. I was home alone and went to take the dogs out for a walk. Again, the property was big and bordered by a forest, with a tree line separating neighbors on one side of the house, and my great aunt on the other side of the house sharing our 2-acre wide lawn. The property was about 1.5 acres deep as well, so I normally just took the 3 little dogs to the far tree line, then to the side tree line, and if they hadn't done their business yet, I'd take them up the front yard. I hadn't even made it all the way down to the far tree line before they'd all done their business, and if they hadn't gotten it out there, I don't know what I would have done. So I started to take them back to the house when I hear a rustling noise way over in the side of the tree line, about a full acre away from where I was standing with the pups. Sound traveled strangely far in my backyard, maybe because it was so open before the tree lines. I look over at the tree line, and I swear I'm shaking when I say this, because I've only told a precious few. I see a tall, impossibly pale figure wearing what looked to be a dark gray suit and matching top hat, walking very strangely into my back tree line. Because my mind couldn't comprehend what the F I was seeing in broad but late daylight, I at first thought it was my neighbor from across the side tree line. But seeing the way it walked, looking closer at its skin confirmed the worst. When I say impossibly white, I mean it was just about the color of paper. Its skin stood out so much against the gray of the suit. I was seeing it from the side at first, so I didn't really get a look at its face, but from what I could see, it didn't really look like it had one. It was maybe 7 feet tall, and it went back and forth from hunching and straightening up as it walked. If you've played soccer, you'd know what knee highs are. Now imagine walking very slowly doing knee highs, taking one knee up to your chest, then the other, all the way up. That's how this thing walked. And from what I could see, there wasn't any hair on its head, nothing but a drab top hat. And it walked right next to my side tree line, looking and walking towards my far tree line. The dogs finally noticed that I was standing in the same place for a little too long, and looked over at this thing that I was seeing. Then one of my dogs barked and I freaked the F out. I looked back up, expecting to see it start running at me, but I think it was much creepier that it continued to walk the same way, towards the back tree line without looking over. All it did was slow down. Then my other dogs got in on the barking, and I just watched as it kept slowly walking towards my tree line. Who doesn't look in the direction of a dog barking, especially when it's really loud and echoing around the property? That's when I got this intense feeling of danger and grabbed all 3 pups and sprinted back to the house. Right when I was opening the back door, I looked back. I could barely see it still, but it was now standing still on the edge of the tree line, its legs hidden by brush, but its top hat and torso clearly visible. I locked all of the doors, windows, closed all of the curtains, turned off the lights, and cried on the couch with my dogs in my arms until my brother got home. I told him about it, and he was genuinely confused, because didn't believe me, but saw how scared I was. So he insisted it was a white-tailed deer or something, and made fun of me for thinking I saw Slenderman, even though I insisted that this thing wasn't lanky and wore a top hat. I had even called him when he was on his way, telling him to be careful and to pull into the garage rather than stop in the driveway and walk outside to the front door. My dad bought a new house. I guess I mean property, because it was barely even built when we bought it, intending it to be a camp 30 minutes away from his old house. It had no insulation, barely running water, no floor, etc. Dad and I built it up from that, adding an enclosed porch overlooking a brook, and built my room. Before we had restored it, that place always gave me the creeps. It was a lot like the feeling of the previous house, danger. But when it was restored, I felt great. I like to go for walks down our driveway, which by the way is a half-mile long one way, and a mile long the back way. It's really in the woods. The closest neighbors are a 7-minute drive away, so it was soothing to go for a walk down a nice dirt road surrounded by nature. But then I started getting that bad feeling again, and I started seeing things in the trees I couldn't make out. On one walk, I could have sworn I saw the figure in the top hat, faceless and now facing me, standing deep in the woods. Several times I somewhat thought I saw it, but this time I was near convinced, so I ran back to my house and I swear I could hear it running after me. But when I turned around at the clearing with my house, there was nothing there. But since I'm not completely convinced that I saw it or heard the footsteps, I'm not entirely sure that it was that figure. Not to mention I was 30 minutes away from my old house. This is when I started seeing those little pale guys out of the corner of my eye. I only saw them inside, and usually when it was dark. It all started at my dad's new house, but they seemed to follow me everywhere. The first time I saw one, I was going to the bathroom right before bed. It was pitch black out, and I left the door open since I was the only person sleeping downstairs, and my dad and his girlfriend were passed out upstairs. Since the door was open, I was looking directly into the kitchen, where we have a big marble island in the middle of it. I saw these long, pale fingers with claws slowly reaching around the corner of the island, but only if I looked over there out of the corner of my eye. I have very strange peripheral vision and can see very clearly using it, so I could see those fingers very clearly. So then I stared straight at the island, hoping not to see those fingers again, but eventually, even though now I was looking straight at it and not using my peripheral vision, I saw a face emerge from around the corner close to the floor. It looked eerily like a drawing I made as a kid, but I don't remember seeing this thing prior to that moment. It was white, much like the top hat dude, but with dark splotches all over it. It had dark sunken holes for eyes that I'm not exactly sure if it had eyes at all. And for a mouth, much like this drawing I had made, it didn't have a mouth hole, but a thin line of crusted and dripping goo in the form of a grin along its face. No hair, Yeah, imagine seeing that in the dark. Unpleasant. But then it just sort of faded out of existence as I was looking at it. It didn't suddenly disappear, but slowly faded away from my sight. So I got out and laid in bed terrified it would come back. I couldn't see it in my room though. I never have. Not there at least. And then, almost every night after that, I saw the same thing. Sometimes it crawled really fast past the bathroom doorway. I could see it move so clearly in the corner of my eye. It wasn't built like a human. It walked on all fours, but instead of an arched back like a human would have, its back was flat, and its legs were long and skinny and built like a messed up dog, except for the arms, which were short with those long clawed fingernails. And I still see this thing. I've gotten so used to seeing it, I'm not even scared anymore, just weirded out and wondering if I'm crazy. A couple days ago, here at my mom's apartment, I saw it on the floor beside my bed. But when I turned back to look at it more, it scampered away. But it sounded like something was clawing at my rug all night long. Kinda like a cat. Both of my cats are dead, and they never play with a rug. So this weird thing was playing at the foot of my bed with my rug. So yeah, I think I'm haunted. Even though the poltergeist activity only happens at my dad's old house. I've seen one thing move in my room here at my mom's one time. I had my slippers at the end of my dresser. One night, I walked into my room and one of my slippers had somehow gotten slurped up underneath my dresser. So I pulled it out from under, wipe it off and go to leave my room again when I hear it slide once more. This was recent. And since I'm so used to ghosts, this only annoyed me rather than scared me. Like, come on, my slippers? Do better. But I turned around and sure enough, the same slipper was completely underneath my dresser again. It hasn't happened since. Nothing has moved around me since. But I'm curious what the spirit from my dad's, which did feel malevolent, followed me here after all these years. But why? And even more creepily, although I'm the happiest I've ever been as of right now, the haunting seems to be the worst. Only the feeling of the ghost's presence isn't scary anymore. It's almost relaxing to know that they're there, and I don't know why it suddenly changed. But the weird thing is that I'm constantly waking up with scratch marks on my wrists, arms, and hands. Scratches that range from the size of my thumb to the size of my fingernail. I sleep with my arms tucked into my chest and I have long fingernails, but this has never happened before. If anyone knows what this means, I'd really appreciate some help. I could just be paranoid. After writing this, I'm a little nervous to deal with my ghostie and everything else I've experienced. I have a tiny scratch at the base of my thumb right now, actually. Again, I'd love to know what people think about all of this, and if anyone has seen similar things. I really hope I'm not alone here. I'll try to keep this relatively short, as there isn't a whole lot to it. When I was a kid, I would stay over at my grandfather's house every other day while my mother was out doing stuff. Normally, I don't feel scared of this house unless it's late at night, but something happened in the morning when I was 4 years old. This particular morning, my aunt, who was staying upstairs for a period of time, had left the house before either me or my grandfather had awoke. Later, my grandfather, assuming she was still asleep upstairs, had left to run some errands. I would sleep in the same bed as him, so when I woke up, I noticed he wasn't in bed and called out to him. After a few minutes, I began to panic, and I got out of bed to run upstairs to see if my aunt was there. And that's when I saw it. A tall, pitch-black figure standing directly in front of her door, which was closed. There were literally no features on this figure, and it stood completely motionless. My best description is that it looked like a three-dimensional, humanoid shadow. I began to creep towards it, but when I got close to it, I decided to just go back downstairs, still panicking with tears in my eyes. I wasn't scared of the shadow, but I guess my human nature kicked in and told me not to get within arm's length of something I didn't understand. My mother, discovering I was alone from talking to both my aunt and grandfather, sped over to his house as quickly as possible to pick me up. I was more afraid that I'd get in trouble for peeing the bed than I was of the shadow man upstairs. When I changed my clothes and got in the car, my mother asks me, "Did you try to go upstairs to see if your auntie was there?" To which I replied, "I tried to, but that man was standing in front of the door." Keep in mind, this is coming from a 4-year-old who barely has a grasp of the concept of lying. Imagine hearing that from your kid randomly, of all things. I'm an adult now, and have heard from my mother that when she was younger and was studying over at my grandfather's house, that one night she woke up and saw 2 men talking in the hallway, but couldn't make out what they were saying. When she screamed to wake her dad up and turned back towards the hallway, they were gone. My grandfather's house is pretty old, so between these 2 experiences, I think there is at least one spirit haunting his house. I haven't really experienced any more paranormal stuff other than seeing a shadow of what looked like my dog running to the side of my bed. My buddy saw it too. But I'll never forget that tall, featureless figure. Before I get into this story, I want to preface that everything I'm telling you is 100% true. There's enough fake stories on here that I don't want to make one up myself. This happened to me in my early teens. I'm 21 now. My best friend growing up had this huge farmhouse in the middle of Virginia. It was very old and beautiful, but also had a very dark history. In the house, there is a tunnel that led to an underground room of sorts that was used for slaves to hide in the 1800s. And I'm 90% sure that some died down there while in hiding, so you can imagine the history and energy that fills this house. I always felt scared there. I never felt alone, and wouldn't go anywhere alone in the house, even just to grab something out of my room. Even the family was scared to stay there with no company because of the intense apparitions and experiences, which I can get into another day. The rooms were massive, and the entire house was white, with honestly creepy vintage decor. There was even a cabinet of ventriloquist dolls upstairs. No joke. They were a really odd family, honestly, with lots of dark problems. Anyways, the second time I visited that house, I was with my mom, my best friend at the time, and her mom. It was a girls' trip. One night I woke up and was so thirsty, and the last thing I wanted to do was go downstairs and get water. I was terrified. I hated that house at night, but my mom was deep asleep, so I literally sprinted downstairs with my head only looking at the floor. I made my water in 5 seconds, and when I made it to the stairs, something compelled me to look at the giant glass doors that were in front of the stairs. I was horrified, but felt like I needed to look out the window. What I saw when I looked out that window will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw a man as real as anything I've ever seen. It was pitch black outside with a huge bright moon. The man was all black, like a silhouette, but because of the moon being so bright, I could clearly see his entire body. He was blacker than black, like he stood out so much. I 100% thought he was a trespasser. He was wearing a top hat and was unhumanly tall, like 7 feet. My heart literally felt like it stopped beating. I felt like I was in a trace. I was so unexplainably horrified, but I couldn't look away. He was moving a little bit, almost like breathing. Then about 10 seconds later, he was gone, disappearing into thin air. I panicked and bolted upstairs after I snapped out of my trance. I cried to my mom and was up all night. The next morning, I told my friend and her mom about the experience, and they were not shocked at all, as they had seen multiple full-body apparitions in the house themselves. The nanny that worked for them even refused to go into some of the rooms of the house. I never went back to that house again. Growing up, I always knew that my childhood home was a little different. Strange things would happen without explanation, and an eerie feeling would often linger in the air. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway, but when I opened my door, no one was there. Another time, I found a toy that I had lost months prior sitting in the middle of my room, as if it had been placed there deliberately. But the most vivid experience I had was when I was home alone and heard someone whisper in my name. I called out, thinking it was a family member, but there was no response. Suddenly, the lights flickered and my room grew colder. I felt a presence in the room with me, and knew without a doubt that it was not human. I never felt unsafe in my childhood home, but the unexplainable occurrences definitely left an impression on me. Even now, years later, I still wonder what kind of energy or entity resided in that house. Have you ever experienced anything like this? This morning I remembered a story told to me by my mom, who had in turn heard it from her mom, my grandmother. In the late 1930s, my grandmother was a young woman living in a farm in Yorkshire, England. She would walk to and from school every day along the country lanes surrounding the farm. One winter afternoon, as she was walking back home, she saw a man lying in the middle of the road, covered in what she assumed was mud. It was getting dark, but she described him wearing a light trench coat, and the mud was very bold, as it contrasted in blotches against the fabric. Even in sleepy 1930s rural England, young women knew the dangers posed by strange men. As the whole scene looked so odd, she decided to go out of her way and walk through farmland back to her home. She told her parents about it. Her father went to see for himself, but found nothing there. That was the end of it. A year later, she walked back from school, and when she got home, her parents told her there had been an accident. A man had been found near the farm. He'd either been trampled by a horse or hit with a car. The man was dead. They told her not to go into the kitchen, as that was where his body was being kept while they waited for help. Curiosity got the better of her, of course. She looked in the kitchen, and on the table she immediately recognized the same man she'd seen lying in the road a year earlier. Only this time she realized the dark blotches on his coat weren't mud, it was blood. I believe this story to be true, simply because it was told to me by my mom, and to her by her mom. What happened, though? Did she have a premonition? Was it some weird time-traveling ghost manifestation? I've not heard of a similar story that I can remember. Ghost on the intercom. Some context. When I was in my early teens, I believed I was followed by the spirit of a young girl. I believe she inhabited one of my porcelain dolls my grandmother had given me. Often I'd see her in my dreams or feel her presence. I can't explain it, but I feel like she may have been the ghost in this story. My parents used to live in a big 3-story house that had an old built-in intercom. There were speakers in every room of the house, minus the bathrooms. And even though it was old, we still liked playing around with it every now and again. You'd have to have the speaker turned on and turn the volume all the way up, usually, to even hear anything clearly. You also had to physically push a button to speak into it. Once in a while, the intercom would come on by itself and play something on the radio. I found this spooky, but my mom brushed it off as the past owner having set an alarm via the intercom so that the radio would come on at certain times. We didn't know how to reprogram it, hard as my stepdad tried, and my parents were tired of often getting woken up at 3 a.m. by the radio randomly coming on through the intercom in their room. So we decided to just not use it anymore, and turned all the intercoms off, with the volume all the way down just as an extra measure. One night I was chatting online with my friends on the computer, and I hadn't noticed the time was around 3 a.m. Suddenly the intercom came on in my room at full blast. It was horribly loud static coming through. I jumped up to shut it off, but as I reached for the volume dial, I saw it was already at 0/off. I didn't know how to make the noise stop. Then through the static, I faintly heard what sounded like someone breathing, and then I heard the voice of a little girl. She said, "When will you come to your senses?" And then just as fast as it had come on, the intercom shut off. Silence. I was frozen with fear. Being a teen, I jumped back on the computer to tell my friends what had just happened, and they said, "Get out of that house." I had to go tell my parents. The hallway was pitch black, and I had to go all the way down a big staircase in the dark to their room. I held my breath and flung my door open, sprinting down the stairs, crying from how scared I was. I banged loudly on my parents' door and heard my mom yelp. She opened the door and I ran in to tell them what had happened. They were more upset that I woke them up. My mom told me it was probably just a commercial on the radio or something. I mentioned how my intercom had been turned off with the volume down to 0, and also what kind of commercial would say something like that. Seeing as it was so late, she didn't feel like trying to rationalize it. I was sent back up to bed, and if you guessed I didn't sleep that night, you'd be correct. I had an unexplainable experience occur about 5 years ago. I was a junior in high school. After the school day was over, my best bud at the time and I went over to his dad's house. With the house to ourselves, our plan was to hunker down in his room and play MCC Halo 2 on Legendary and see truly how hard the game is. We're in the middle of the level outskirts, just before you reach Jackal Sniper Alley, and in the next room over we heard a noise. The adjacent room was the parallel laundry room, which had a closed door to the garage. The garage door's handle squeaks. Our ears catch the noise, and we pause the game just as the door creaks all the way open. We are staring out the bedroom door, into the hallway. We can see the doorway of the laundry room, but not into the room itself. We were expecting to see who was coming in from the garage, assuming it was his dad. Instead, the garage door slammed shut so hard we could feel it connect with the wall. We're stunned. We start freaking out because no one else should be home right now, so I immediately assume there's an intruder. We gather some random items to use as weapons and literally breach the garage like Rainbow Six Siege. We stacked up and opened the door as I yelled, "Whoever the F is in here, come out right effing now." Silence. Stale silence and utter darkness. We flip the lights on and begin to search of the garage. I tell my buddy to check if the side door to the backyard is locked. It is. While he looks around outside, I make note that there are no windows in this garage. No feasible escape that wouldn't leave a trace for us to find. All there was my bud's dad's old, unused rusty truck and a bunch of empty cabinets. Yes, I searched the cabinets. No one was in the garage except for us. I've told multiple people this story, and over the years not a single explanation I haven't already accounted for and disproved. The obvious question is wind. No. I've had wind open or close doors before, and you know when it's the wind. Besides, we would have heard the garage rattling if the wind was hard enough to blow open and slam a door. I would like to note, there is a possibility someone actually did break in and manually opened a garage door to slide out under it. But that is so unlikely. Not only would we have heard it move, but it would make so much more sense to hit the garage hanger button. There's also the possibility that in the midst of the panic, my bud mistook the side door for being locked when it actually wasn't. No matter which way you cut it, I have a freaky ghost/home intruder story. When I was around 12 years old, my best friend and his family moved to the country on a large tract of land with several buildings. The first was an old house that had been the original residence before the previous owner started to construct a new house towards the back of the property. I had stayed there once when they first bought the property, while the old owner was still packing up their other house. But I don't recall much about that night. We had spent all day walking around the land. I just remember being so tired, I went to bed before 8. The weekend that they moved into the house, they invited me to stay the weekend with them. It was a nice new house that the previous owner had built, but didn't quite finish. It wasn't until years later that I found out it was because his wife had passed away, and he just couldn't finish it, so he put it up for sale. It was just a large ground floor that he designed to be accessible, and a large basement that was largely unfinished. When you would go down the stairs to the basement, it opened up to a large room with wood paneling that he had intended to turn into a den, connected to a workshop by a door, all just revealing the concrete floor. Through the workshop, there was another door that led into the garage. He had built a nice long workbench out of the wood, but it had largely looked unused. That weekend, we had moved down a couple couches, furniture, a handful of rugs, and most importantly, the TV and video game systems. After moving everything in, we spent that evening staying up late playing video games. I must have fallen asleep on the couch first, because when I first woke up, I could see the static of the TV still on the TV. I was cold and tired, so I just cozied up and went back to sleep. A little while later, I had awoken and saw his mom walk down the stairs in a robe. I assumed she just wanted to check on us and turn the TV off. I quickly closed my eyes so she wouldn't think that I was awake and left the TV on. After a few moments, I could still hear the slight hiss of the TV and expected it to turn off at any moment, but it didn't. I slowly started to open an eye to peek, and his mom was standing right in front of the TV staring at us. I thought this was weird and quickly closed my eyes. Trying to picture his mom, I suddenly realized, this person is too tall and thin. This woman was not his mom. Slowly opening an eye, I looked down at the TV and the glow of the static was seemingly passing through a set of legs before disappearing at the feet. Quickly closing my eyes, I tried to imagine I was anywhere else. The next morning, I was the first one up, but didn't want to say anything since they just moved in. The next few times I would visit, I would stay in his room in a sleeping bag on the floor, and we would play video games there. It was while looking back, I don't think we ever spent much time down there. This past year, when we finally reconnected after many years, I asked him if he ever had any paranormal experiences at his house. His first response was his basement. He didn't say what, but his cats avoided it, and he felt some kind of presence down there, and he said that he just avoids it when he's there. I don't know if it was the original owner's wife come to check up on the new occupants, but I'll never forget that transparent figure in a knee-length robe standing in front of the TV, disappearing at the feet. Stuff moved in my sleep, and this was never explained. I'll keep it simple. My sister's bed is next to my bed, so close that I use it like a nightstand. I put my clothes for tomorrow and my glasses on that bed before I went to sleep. The glasses were at one end of the bed while I was on the other, and the clothes were on the same end. I woke up at like 2 a.m. for some reason and started playing a game on my iPad when I was going to go to the bathroom. I went to reach for my glasses, only to see they were gone, and my clothes were messed up on the side of the bed close to me, in front of my face. I initially thought my sister just moved my things, so I was just annoyed at first, and started looking for my glasses. And while doing that, it made less and less sense to me that this was the case, because my sister didn't live there, and she didn't have keys to the house. When I did find my glasses, they were at the foot of my bed with my chargers. I put them on, and this is when I really took in the situation. I went to the bathroom very confused and kind of creeped out, but my grandma lives with me, so I just tried to stay calm and ask her in the morning. In the morning when I asked, she said she didn't move my stuff and never got up last night. She said I probably sleepwalked. But that just doesn't seem right to me, because I've never sleepwalked before, and I'm not at the age where it just starts happening as a teenager. When I'm stressed, I can experience insomnia and exhaustion, which triggers episodes of sleep paralysis. But no one's ever told me I sleepwalk, and I'm not a particularly heavy sleeper. Plus, the way I tuck my feet in when I go to sleep under the sheets was the same when I woke up. And I don't know much about sleepwalking, but I thought it's simple motions and repeated behavior. It's a nonsensical pattern, yes, but it's almost too perfect. It's my conclusion that it was my grandmother, but I just don't see that either, because she doesn't sleepwalk either. Just something weird that happened.